right. So I guess what we've got today is we're going over some news coverage of recent legislation, right?
Yes, we are going to be talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA,
Mhm.
and also more minorly the CHIPS Act, and sort of how the two are intertwined and the political skullduggery, you might say, that was employed to get these passed.
Okay, okay. So what have we got? I know you were digging through some news
hmm
stuff yesterday. What have we got on that front?
Yeah. So I've got about 5 articles here that I think do a really good job of sort of going over the big and the small. And I think we'll start with this initial one that talks about, it gives a sort of very broad overview of the Inflation Reduction Act. It is an opinion piece from the New York Times by Daddy Paul Krugman, who I'm a big fan of. So let me just throw that up, and you should be able to see that.
Yes, I can.
Here we go. Did Democrats just save civilization?
Wow,
Based. Opinion by Paul Krugman. This was put
that's
out
that's
August 8th, 2 days ago.
that seems like a bit of a far reach in the title
hmm
there.
Well, let's find out. They really did it. The Inflation Reduction Act, which is mainly a climate change bill with a side helping of health reform, passed the Senate on Sunday. By all accounts, it will easily pass the House, so it's about to become law. This is a very big deal. The act isn't by itself enough to avert climate disaster, but it is a huge step in the right direction and sets the stage for more action in years ahead. It will catalyze progress in green technology. Its economic benefits will make passing additional legislation easier. It gives the United States the credibility it needs to lead a global effort to limit greenhouse gas emissions. There are, of course, cynics, eager to denigrate the achievement. Some on the left rush to dismiss the bill as a giveaway to the fossil fuel industry posing as environmental action. More important, Republicans, who unanimously oppose the legislation, are shouting the usual things they shout: big spending, inflation. But actual experts on energy and the environment are giddy over what has been accomplished, and serious economists aren't worried about the effect on inflation.
Yeah,
Start with the
I,
environmental
I
side.
like how his contrast is like Republicans say this, but real experts say that. This
Yeah.
is it's funny that he puts it that way, but
Start with the environmental side. Many people I talk to assume that President Biden's environmental agenda, as contained in his original Build Back Better proposal, must have been greatly watered down in the legislation we got. After all, didn't Democrats have to make big concessions to win over Senator Joe Manchin? Aren't there important giveaways to fossil fuel interests, like aid for controversial natural gas pipeline? However, energy analysts believe that the adverse climate effects from these concessions will be swamped by the gains from tax credits for clean energy. The REPEAT project, compiled by Princeton Zero Lab, has produced a side by side comparison of emissions cut under the Inflation Reduction Act and the earlier House version of Build Back Better. By 2035, the Inflation Reduction Act, they estimate, will have delivered more than 90% of the emissions reduction that Build Back Better would have achieved. After all that legislative drama, Biden's climate policy has emerged essentially intact. How is that possible? Right at the beginning, the Biden administration decided that climate policy would be all carrots, no sticks. That it would provide incentives to do the right thing, not penalties for doing the wrong things. This strategy, it hoped, would prove politically feasible in a way that, say, a carbon tax wouldn't. And this hope has been vindicated. Furthermore, it's a strategy that seems likely to pay political dividends in the future. One new study by E. Mark Curtis and Iona. Oh, Jesus. I'm so sorry. Iona
Iowana? I don't know.
Ioana Martinescu,
Marinescu?
Iona Martinescu finds that, quote, the growth of renewable energy leads to the creation of relatively high paying jobs, which are more often than not located in areas that stand to lose from a decline in fossil fuel extraction jobs, end quote. So what did the Biden administration lose? Unfortunately, much of the social spending Build Back Better originally included. Child tax credits, universal pre-K, and more was cut. That's tragic. Although enhanced health insurance subsidies, which have helped bring America's uninsured rate to a record low, have been extended. But Democrats delivered on their climate promises more or less in full. What about the critique from the right? Aside from the pathetic attempt to portray the Inflation Reduction Act as a big tax hike on the middle class, Republicans like Mitt Romney are trying to lump this legislation in with last year's American Rescue Plan, which they claim caused inflation to spike. Never mind whether this claim is true. The key thing is to do the math. The Inflation Reduction Act calls for spending less than $500 billion over a decade, compared with the American Rescue Plan's $1.9 trillion in a single year, and will actually reduce the deficit. That's why independent analysts find that it will have little effect on inflation. But it but if the spending isn't very large, how can it have such a big impact? The answer is that right now we're sitting on a sort of cusp. Renewable energy technology has made revolutionary progress, and renewables are already cheaper in many areas than fossil fuels. A moderate push from public policy is all that it will take to transition to a much greener economy, and the Inflation Reduction Act will provide that push. Given all this, however, why did every single Republican senator vote against the Inflation Reduction Act? They aren't all ignorant and innumerate. I'm pretty sure that Romney, for example, knows that he's talking nonsense. Nor can we easily invoke differences in ideology. The Inflation Reduction Act's climate push mostly relies on tax credits, and Republicans have themselves used tax credits to achieve social goals, like the much abused Opportunity Zone credits in Donald Trump's 2017 tax cut. Almost surely, what we're really looking at is the politics of spite. Every Republican in the Senate was willing to kill our best chance at avoiding climate disaster simply to deny the Biden administration a win. And the good news is that the legislation passed in spite of their spite, and the world is a more hopeful place than it was just a few weeks ago.
Okay, so it doesn't get too much into the details of the legislation itself, but
Mhm.
but just a little bit into the political strategy around it. It seems funny to me to say that Biden's political strategy is vindicated by this. I mean, maybe that seems like halfway justified by this, because obviously, it's an environment where it is difficult to for him to pass any legislation at all, and just the fact that he got
Yep.
something done is going to be halfway vindicating. Whether this particular bill turns out the way they hope is another question, though.
Yeah, I think Biden has, in a lot of areas, tried to pursue this forced bipartisanism to try and reunite the country in a lot of respects and get away from, what has really been the status quo ever since Obama came into office, in particular in those 2010 midterms, which is like the parties just never work together on almost anything.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important to try and push back against that. Admittedly, we did not get a single Republican senator, but like a true vindication would have been getting like a Mitt Romney or a Susan Collins on board. That could have been really, really big. But still getting the more conservative members of the Democratic Party on board is still, I mean, quite an achievement. Joe Manchin and Sinema, I think, are very noteworthy. So I do think there's some vindication of Biden's ability to sort of wheel and deal. I mean, his experience of like I think it's like 3+ decades in the Senate, I think can really be felt here.
Yeah, and I'm glad he is still trying to compromise and doing it in a way that doesn't come at the expense of actually passing the bill. So,
Yeah.
I would rather that than him become some kind of like hardliner, totally unwilling to work with the other side. It would, which I think a lot of people do want him to do, considering all the times that Obama tried to work with the Republicans and just got no cooperation out of them.
Yep. There are, yeah, I'm just remembering the anecdote from the HBO Vice documentary on the 2009 financial crisis, talking about how the first time TARP went up for votes, the Republicans didn't have the votes and it went down. And Rahm Emanuel storming over to John Boehner and like putting his finger right in his face. But yeah, so that's like a basic overview of the bill. And I think the one of the more interesting things is how we got here, because obviously as Krugman mentioned in that article, this is really a second version of Build Back Better in a lot of respects, which went down previously. So I think it's really interesting to talk about how we got here. And I actually did find this a really good Politico article that sort of goes over just the history of exactly what happened and why.
I hope some of the other articles might actually talk a little more about the specific contents of the bill. And this one, like it did,
I've got some
or
lined up.
the previous one, it did at least say the thing about like that they were primarily trying to use incentives rather than penalties.
Yep. There's a 10% tax credit if you build these renewable energy projects. And I have a couple articles lined up that talk about this if you do them in low income areas. And another 10% on top of that, that can stack up to 20% if you do it in an area that is previously had a lot of jobs related to fossil fuel. So if you go into like West Virginia and start putting up a new solar plant there, you can get like a 20% tax credit, which is like massive. So it's a lot of stuff like that.
What's the argument against the bill? Um,
Joe
sincere or
Biden
not,
needs
I'm
to take
sure.
his finger off the inflation button. I think there's an argument from the left, which is that this doesn't go far enough, and that if you do compromise in this, it basically like legitimizes the fact that like we're giving ground when we could be getting more.
Oh,
That's
right.
going to be the argument from the left, and then the argument from the right is going to be either we don't need to be doing this stuff on climate change. It's a big government boondoggle. It's going to contribute to inflation. It's going to be stuff like this. But to be honest, there isn't that much of a coherent Republican like policy on this kind of stuff anymore after 4 years of Trump.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so yeah, I've got a couple articles lined up on the contents of the bill, and I've also got one talking about sort of the political process as to how we got here, flipping Manchin, and then the sort of Schumer Manchin getting over McConnell in regards to the chips bill.
Okay, cool, cool.
So, all right. So from Politico.com, the cinema Manchin split that shaped the Dems deal. The West Virginia centrist spent months with Chuck Schumer molding Democrats' party line agenda. In the final hours, he had to accept several of his Arizona colleagues' demands. For months, Joe Manchin was a Democrat with all the leverage, and at the end, even he had to cede some ground. After Manchin agreed with Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer on the party line tax, healthcare, and energy bill, the West Virginia Democrat found himself bargaining with fellow moderate Senator Kyrsten Sinema. Both hard-nosed negotiators, the Arizona Democrats' business-friendly tax approach clashed sharply with Manchin's more progressive position on taxes. Manchin sought to target the wealthy and ended up agreeing with Schumer to target the so-called carried interest loophole that allows some people to pay lower tax rates on investment income. He also signed off on a corporate minimum tax package that most Democrats believe Sinema supported. Ultimately, Sinema took a scalpel to the corporate minimum tax and scuttled any changes to carried interest, which Manchin called particularly painful. Triangulating between them through all of it, Schumer, whose job was harmonizing the views of the very public Manchin with an often silent Sinema. Quote, "We had to argue with each other on issues, but we tried to respect each other," end quote. Schumer said of Manchin on Sunday as he chomped on a celebratory meal of leftover pasta cooked by his wife. Quote, "Sienema, if she gives you her word, you got it. But she's not a schmoozer like Manchin," end quote.
So what do you know off the top of your head? Like, what is the carried interest thing? I know I've heard of that before, but I can't remember what it means.
Yeah, I know a basic thing. Finance is really fucking complicated, so I always try to, caveat my words. But basically, the carried interest, I believe, is the idea that if you take a loss, you can carry that forward on the investment incomes you have. So it's kind of similar to what Donald Trump fraudulently or allegedly fraudulently did in his tax returns, where he was using losses in investments to then carry over to capital gains. But apparently, there is some basic way to sort of carry forward that on investment incomes. So, like, you might take a loss in like 2018, but then somehow, and then because you lost money, you get to apply that as like a deduction to your taxes, right? If you're not making money, a lot of times you won't have to pay taxes, and you can then sort of carry forward that loss in such a way where it looks like you're not making money in subsequent years, even though you really are. That's
Okay,
my like
so
basic just to understand.
so then, like, suppose I lose money one year, I make money the following year, then they're taxing me as if, like, just on the net gain over the course of the 2 years,
Yes,
rather than
yeah,
okay.
that's like the most basic overview as I understand it. Almost exactly 1 year after Manchin and Sinema teamed with Republicans to pass a historic infrastructure bill, the two moderates on Sunday cast decisive votes for the Democrats' second piece of the puzzle. It was far smaller than the party's original $3.5 trillion vision, but larger than the slim healthcare legislation that lawmakers were considering just 2 weeks ago. It's probably the last big party line bill Democrats will be able to deliver for years, with the House expected to flip to Republicans in the November elections. The package delivered more than $300 billion in climate and energy investments, reformed prescription drug prices, and created a new minimum tax on large corporations. Sunday's passage of the legislation marked a triumphant moment for a party that for years has talked big game on lowering drug prices and fighting climate change. The year-long drama demonstrated the difficulties Schumer faces every day in running a 50-50 Senate, corralling a caucus that includes 47 other senators with their own ideas, plus Sinema and Manchin, two center senators with divergent priorities. Twice, in full view on the Senate floor, Manchin animatedly conversed with Sinema about his deal, including pieces of tax legislation that Sinema felt would stymie economic growth in Arizona. Manchin observed his relationship with Sinema in the tax dispute, quote, "We have more in common than we don't. I just have a difference on this," end quote. Quote, "They're both pains in the neck, but pains in the neck I respect," end quote, said Senator John Hickenlooper, D. Colorado, admirably. Quote, "I don't feel like they've ever misled me or said something that was untrue," end quote. Manchin killed the $1.7 trillion Build Back Better bill in December after failed negotiations with President Joe Biden. 2 months later, Schumer and Manchin broke bread, and Manchin delivered his negotiating position. He wanted to wait for April before trying again, and when they did, he only wanted to talk to Schumer. After Russia invaded Ukraine and Europe's energy supplies were squeezed while the U.S. gas prices began rising, Manchin then saw an opportunity to make big climate change investments while simultaneously boosting fossil fuel production this spring. Quote, "This is the catapult that basically launched me," end quote, Manchin said in an interview. Quote, "Iran is the greatest proliferator supportive of terrorism in the world, right? And we're going to give them money over my dead body," end quote. It's so funny to me that that is sort of the angle by which that he sort of gets on board with energy reform. And I mean, it
Yeah.
is a very effective one that I think a lot of people have been talking about for a while, which is like, we wouldn't have to care about the Middle East so much if it wasn't for our energy independence on things like OPEC and stuff like that. Part of the reason why we have such a complex relationship with Saudi Arabia, for example. And
Yeah, I mean,
it's
it
sad to
does
finally see that
makes
filter.
it makes sense to me that he cares about that. But yeah, like you said, it's funny that that would be the priority, right? Like, you would think. I don't know, the whole like energy independence thing would be important regardless of any of that, but
Yeah. It kind of reminds me, there's this famous saying, politics makes strange bedfellows, and
yeah.
how during prohibition, or not even just prohibition, but in a lot of places in the US, there are still dry counties. And back in the day, there was a real unholy alliance of bootleggers and like religious people who were both trying to maintain restrictions or bans on alcohol for very different reasons, obviously. But
Right.
at the end of the day, you know, if they're gonna vote for the thing that you want, then that's all that matters.
Yeah. Um it I didn't follow the story closely of him killing the previous bill either. So I don't know. It's just it a lot of this like political negotiation stuff strikes me as really like strange or like maybe even like strategically dumb, right? Because I would think, suppose I'm Joe Manchin and there's some things I don't like about the bill, and it makes sense that if I have some leverage, I'm gonna try to get other people to make concessions to me. But it doesn't make a lot of sense to me that I'm gonna actually like go ahead and kill a bill if I think it's a net positive.
hmm I think a lot of it has to do with sort of the optics. Joe Manchin doesn't want to, you know, be singled out. He's in a very vulnerable position. The only like probably one of the only Democrats in West Virginia on a state level. So I think a big part of it is trying to avoid as much headlines as possible.
Hmm.
And the other part of it is I think people really underestimate how much the politics, even at like the highest level, the United States federal Senate, politics even at that high of a level can really be dictated by like, oh fuck you, you son of a bitch, whatever, we're not doing that. Like it could just be a couple guys negotiating around a table, and it's sort of this moment like, wait, this is it? Like this is the most power? It's like, yep, this is it. And I think it actually sort of goes to a lot of conspiracy theories come from this place of like, oh, come on, there has to be some crazy, like, establishment institution in control, making sure, it can't just be five guys around a table, right? And it's like, no, it really is. Like, that's all there is to it.
I mean, it's funny that like it's like we don't even have a better decision making process in the world than just like putting five people around a table and
Yep.
having them fight it out.
By late June, he and Schumer were looking at a package that brought in more than $1 trillion in revenue and spent significantly more than the package that passed Sunday. Sinema's team was generally clued into the package, and she told leaders in mid July that she still didn't support the carried interest provision. But Manchin began having second thoughts after the July 4 recess as inflation indicators continued to flash red. Then came July 14th. Quote, I just said, Chuck, I can't do that. That's when he got mad, end quote, Manchin said. Quote, half an hour later, they put the dogs on me, end quote. Manchin says that he never took it personally, yet there are two schools of thought in the Democratic caucus about whether the pressure campaign worked. Some argue that the attacks on Manchin from his own colleagues drove him back to the table. Others say a cohort of Democratic senators who quietly reassured Manchin amid the blowback proved far more effective. After that blowup,
And I
Democrats.
would really want to know the answer to that.
Yeah, it's really curious. I remember I read a great article um, back in December around the time when Build Back Better was happening that talked about Manchin's boat that senators would and legislators would come meet on as like a casual, like business casual type space where they wouldn't talk business. And the article talked about how it's one of the last places that this happened, and that there used to be way more. Someone's house where Ted Cruz and like Chuck Schumer would be like talking about a football game over a beer, and how these places, on their face being not political, actually served a great utility for being political as a place where you could break bread, talk, some stuff, cool off, and then be like, okay, so come on, what can we do on this bill? I think it's actually very similar to if you've ever had like a friend group where there's like a two people have been in a fight and they don't talk to each other for a while, but then they get back together as part of a group gathering and everyone's chill and relaxed and it sort of takes the edge off it. And then halfway through the night, one of them approaches the other and says, man, I'm sorry about that. It's a lot like that. And one of the last places you can do this is like apparently Joe Manchin's boat. That's like a really big, like almost like yacht type deal where there's like a kitchen and stuff, and you can and like you're not allowed to wear like you have to wear like Hawaiian t-shirts and stuff, like no suits allowed. Like yeah, it's really funny to hear about this stuff because it really does like bring it back down to earth. Like yeah, these are just like random people, that are just like you and me. And
Well, besides having a boat.
yeah, I mean, they, they are substantially more wealthy, but I just mean in terms of like their personality. They're not like these like
Right.
god legislator gods that they're just normal people, and a lot of the same sort of dumb, stupid like conversational tricks that work in our friend groups work in the friend group of the United States Senate.
Like I'm tempted to make comparisons again to gaming, which we've talked about a couple other times. Because if you think about like poker players, for example, like the a lot of the top poker players in the world really are like a lot better at poker than just random people in your local casino. But
Mhm.
it seems like what we're saying is that perhaps that's not true in politics. That
Yeah, well, I think the trick is that in politics, it's not like it's a game that you can reduce to a science. It is the art of human relations and making deals, and that's always going to be a messy affair, muddled with the fact that we're a bunch of evolved lizards running around.
I mean, I guess part, yeah, there's that. I think part of it though is that the process by which we select politicians doesn't match up perfectly well to the skills that they then have to apply when they're in
Yep.
office, right? Like running the skill of running a campaign isn't the same as the skill of statecraft or whatever it is that they're doing.
Yeah. After that blowup, Democrats coalesced around prescription drug reform and a short extension of the Affordable Care Act subsidies, regulating energy, climate change, and taxes to the dustbin. Manchin quietly resumed his talks with Schumer just 4 days later. When they announced the deal on July 27th, the Democratic caucus was triumphant. There was one problem. Sienema was now in the dark. In fact, Sienema was informed about the deal by number 2 Republican John Thune on the Senate floor. She had huge influence on the Build Back Better bill, stripping out tax rate increases to assemble a tax package more palatable to her business-friendly state. And she and Senator Chris Murphy, Democrat Connecticut, laid out groundwork last year for what would become a key part of Democrats' prescription drug proposal. But Sienema never agreed to the carried interest provision, and she had other objections. As Manchin and Sienema held their own conversations, they were helped along by Hickenlooper and Senator Mark Warner, Democrat Virginia. While Warner tried to come to a compromise on carried interest with Sienema, Hickenlooper suggested a stock buyback excise tax to compensate Siena's requested changes on corporate minimum tax. Quote, there's kind of been a trust building relationship going on, end quote, Warner said. Quote, it became clear that some of the changes that Senator Sienema wanted were creating some holes, end quote. On August 4th, Warner joined Manchin on his houseboat. Yep, this is what I was just mentioning. This is what I was just mentioning to talk about the deal. Sienema would soon announce on taxes. After getting soaked in a rainstorm, Warner left with a new outfit, wearing a pair of Manchin shorts and a T-shirt, and hoped that Manchin, Sienema, and Schumer would see eye to eye. On Saturday, Manchin returned Warner's suit fully pressed. But Sienna wasn't quite done. Even after scuttling language that limited businesses' ability to write off some investments, when Democrats unveiled the final legislation Saturday, it imposed a 15% minimum tax on some businesses owned by private equity. That had been included in previous versions of legislation, but omitted from the final initial draft of the deal with Manchin. Sienna opposed it, an alarming development. Quote, I thought we wouldn't pass the bill, end quote, Schumer said. Quote, it was hard to figure out how to make it work, end quote. Manchin said once he agreed with Schumer that the two were, quote, hooked to the hip, end quote, at preventing changes to the bill that could jeopardize its passage, which Schumer said was a, quote, linchpin, end quote, of the agreement. Sinema had no such deal, and when the legislation came to the floor for amendment votes, she'd privately teamed with Thune to reverse the tax change. That required Manchin and the rest of the Democrats to make yet another compromise. Schumer went around the Senate floor telling his members that while they might not like it, they had to eat the change to pass the bill. Schumer's members were unhappy, according to one Senate Democrat, but exhausted and resigned to doing what it took to finish the bill. Warner stepped in with a way to fill that revenue hole, too. About 15 minutes later, the bill passed after 22 hours on the Senate floor.
But it's weird that they don't specify how it is that they filled the revenue hole.
Yeah, there's I saw a really good breakdown of that. I think it might be in one of the articles coming up, but
Okay.
yeah, I guess I just more focused on the legislative story. I just think, yeah, this it really just goes to show you like how, in particular, I think it's when they talked about here, Schumer's members were unhappy. I think it really goes to show you how really feckless the parties are as an institution of power in America, especially compared to other things, where it's a real effort to try and make sure that your members are voting in line, right? That's not just like a guaranteed thing. Promises have to be made. There has to be go back and forth, and there are times where it doesn't happen, right? I mean, we just mentioned the thing with TARP the first time it went up in 2007. Um, there's a real give and take from trying to get people to take votes that they don't like or are going to be unpopular. And I think this is very revealing of how this political process works in the Senate, and the House as well, where it really is a game of trying to convince people, almost like bar talk, of like who's going to win the Super Bowl. It's almost bar talk of like, is this vote going to cost you your reelection? And trying to be like, come on, take one for the team. We really need this to get through. Yeah, I just find this stuff super fascinating and revealing. For Schumer, it was the capstone of a 50-50 Senate in which he passed new laws on gun safety, infrastructure, veteran health benefits, and microchip manufacturing. For Sinema, the moment demonstrated that she's simply not in lockstep with Manchin or the rest of her caucus. And for Manchin, the legislation converted on his reputation from the guy that stopped Biden's agenda cold in its tracks to the cold state senator that not only cut a deal on climate, but helped sell it in any way he could. Quote, I've never seen a more balanced piece of legislation coming together, end quote, Manchin said. Quote, we never knew this day would ever come, end quote.
So we were talking about like some of these votes could cost people their reelection, but the way that this story is framed, it seems like it would be a positive development for almost everybody involved, right?
I mean, I think there's a difference between the actual effects the bill will have in terms of helping the country and whether or not this is going to cost you to some degree in the future.
For sure,
I
but
think
I mean, I
I'm
guess
reminded of like there's a lot of Democratic senators that lost their careers because they helped get Obamacare through. Even though it arguably helped their states, a lot of people knew like I'm gonna get this huge piece of historic legislation through, but like I'm done after this.
I mean, I guess what I'm thinking though is like Manchin and Cinema get to walk away from this thinking like I successfully compromised and got them to make
Mm.
concessions to to pass a bill that was palatable to me. The rest of the Democrats get to just get to point out the fact that they passed anything at all, right? Like that seems like a political win, and then the Republicans all got to vote no, and they get to go back to their Republican constituents and say like we stood up against the big bad Democrats, and it's just like I don't see it, to me. Like it's hard for me to see how this is costly to any of them.
Well, I think it's a question of voters sometimes being very foolish. For example, when this goes to the House, I bet that at least some of the squad will vote against it because they're going to say we want a better version, and they're going to be pulling for that. And for the Democratic senators, I think there's this real thing of it probably won't necessarily cost me my election, but it could hurt me, right? And that's the kind of thing that's really up in the air. Someone that is like a senator of like a very blue state, maybe like New Hampshire, might get seen as like you kowtowed to Manchin. How you sold out?
So you think it might
And get
hurt
worried
them?
about that.
You think it might hurt them because they'll get primaried or something? Is that the idea?
I think there is a risk when you vote on a greatly compromised piece of legislation that your base is going to look at it and see the compromises that the other side got and be like, I can't believe you supported this, and that'll hurt you in some degree, right? There's probably not many senators that are worried that this is literally going to destroy their political career, but there's probably like a decent contingent that are like, this isn't going to be, my base isn't going to like this, or I myself don't like this. I want to push for more. It's that old saying, a compromise leaves everyone unsatisfied.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, that makes some sense, but you would think after years and years of having it be super difficult to get any legislation through the Senate whatsoever, just the fact that they were able to do it by compromising, I like as much as people would like to push for more. I think recent history doesn't validate the idea that they could
Yeah, I
get
mean they
more.
should, but people are just dumb. I'm gonna people should be willing to compromise, and they should be like, you know what, that's okay. And then Kyle Kalinske gets on his show and talks about how 89% of Americans support Medicaid for all, so why can't we get everything we want? There's just such a delusion, I feel like, in both parties, of people online that like secretly everyone agrees with us, and the only reason why we don't get what we want is because of like some corrupt political process, and it's a super poisonous idea.
I mean, maybe just the image of being like a very principled person who just demands
Yeah,
everything
that's
they want is somehow more politically appealing than the image of the person who compromises to get some of what they want rather than nothing.
yep. And I think there's a real delusion that these people have that they think they can get everything they want. Someone like Cenk Uygur says, oh, I'm going to go in the Senate and I'll get us Medicare for all. How? What am I going to do for me? I'm going to fight. I'm going to fight like hell. And it's like,
You're
oh,
gonna go punch Mitch
oh.
McConnell in the face, or like,
Well, when he says fight, I assume he means like really negotiate aggressively. And you'll see this a lot in like the more Justice Dem type areas online, where they'll say like, if Democrats played hardball like Republicans did, we could get the things. And these people seem to be under the delusion that all it would take to get like Medicare for all through is to just fight like hell in the Senate. And it's like, I wish it was that easy, but it is not. It is not even close. We just can't get the overwhelming left wing image of what the country ought to be because the country is not overwhelmingly left wing.
and on top of that, the Senate is a conservative leaning institution
Yep.
that makes it um, like even if you had like a 55 or 60% left leaning country, it would still be difficult to get a lot of this stuff through. But
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's super interesting to see the very human and small one-on-one negotiations dictate such important stuff. The idea that it's like Manchin, Schumer, and Sinema in a room, and they're like, okay, how can we make this deal happen? And then that's it. And then this massive, one of the most historic pieces of legislation, probably like the last 10 years, goes through as a result. That's just crazy to me to
yeah,
really think about. It really hits home.
man, I was saying a thing a few minutes ago about it's like I guess we just don't have any better decision making process in the world than just putting some people around a table and having them just freeform negotiate. But like, I think that's probably not actually true. Like there
Mhm.
probably exists some type of more structured decision making process that you could like theoretically employ in
Yeah.
this type of
The,
scenario.
the problem is, how do you implement that kind of decision um, making structure within the context of this is the most powerful country on the face of the planet. Everyone gets a vote. Everyone wants some sort of influence, and that's when it gets really messy. It's the reason why, like, DC and Puerto Rico aren't going to be states anytime soon because Republicans just aren't going to do that because they'd be massively blue states. No one is going to consent to changes to the political system unless it's sort of a 50-50 type scenario. That's why we always admitted, a free state and a slave state at the same time in the past.
Right. So I guess a lot of the institutions that we have now came up during a time when people were really unhappy with the previous institutions. Right. This is like when they were writing the
Nope.
Constitution kind of implemented all these type of structures that probably seemed really like wild at the time. Right.
No.
And it's probably the context that allowed them to get away with that type of restructuring and that type
Yep.
of like
Dramatic
rethinking.
change only happens in dramatic times. It's very similar to the Andrew Jackson presidency. It was only after the corrupt bargain, which a lot of Americans saw as like, okay, you just literally stole the election. The guy who got less votes and less electoral delegates won. And then it was only in I think it's Martin Van Buren, and it's only in the next election when Andrew Jackson then does win that he implements sweeping reforms where everyone gets a vote now, or well, all white men get a vote now regardless of owning their land. And I think it's under Andrew Jackson as well that the senators are no longer appointed but are elected as well. So yeah, huge sweeping changes like that can only really happen in times of like oh shit, people are not gonna tolerate the status quo anymore. Same thing with like all the reforms we got during Abraham Lincoln. People were really upset about slavery, and also the southern states kind of threw by going into revolt and then giving up all their political representation.
Yeah, so we have this weird scenario today where almost nobody's really like happy with the status quo, but very few people are so unhappy with it that they'd be willing to overthrow it at the risk of letting the other side get their way.
And especially everyone's really unhappy everyone's united in being unhappy, but they're absolutely not united in what we should do. And it's not just that they're not united, they're like polarly opposed, right?
Yeah.
It's like everyone's like, we need to stop this. And one side wants to go super far left, and one side wants to go super far right. And that means that neither of them are going to be working together to do any change. But that means that the underlying conditions that make people unhappy continue to broil, right? It's why I think, the alternate media and stuff like that is something Destiny talks about. I just stole the point from him because it's a true one. It's really damaging when you take political will and waste it, because that's like one of the only things that allows you to do change. In a time of crisis, you can't waste people's reaction to that crisis, because that's going to be the only fuel that you have in order to actually get great change. So if if COVID-19 happens and people are super mad about it, and we basically do nothing with that outrage to like help fix the system, that's really bad, because now the outrage is passed and the system won't be fixed.
I think there was probably some truth to the idea that Obama, when he took office, had a lot of that political will behind him, and he probably wasn't as forceful as he could have been with it, right? So this is like, if I'm trying to steel man the Cenk Uygur point or
Yeah.
whatever, like it's possible that um, given the circumstances in which he came in and the large amount of support that he initially had, perhaps he could have gotten more done if he had fought harder.
Yeah. I mean, he does get Obamacare through, which is huge. But there is a real question of like, maybe he just should have said, okay, midterms, that's gonna suck, but we're gonna do everything right now. We're just gonna do absolutely everything for these in this 2 years that we can.
Yeah, I think it's a lot harder to make that case for Biden. Like, it's not like Biden's going to get any
Yeah.
more done by fighting harder, but perhaps Obama could have. It's hard to know.
Yeah, man, those first legislative sessions, John Boehner, and I mean, there's still people still go back and forth on who exactly was at fault during that stuff. But yeah, it's. eh, I am very sympathetic to the view that Republicans really get away with being the ones who always fucking open the can of worms, and then when Democrats go down that same pathway, the Republicans are like, I can't believe you're doing this, right?
Yeah.
Like that, like Republicans absolutely like grin fucking Democrats over Merrick Garland during Obama's presidency, and then doing obviously doing the exact opposite with Amy Coney Barrett. And these people are like, I can't believe you would even consider adding another Supreme Court justice to the court. I can't even believe you would consider reforming the electoral. It's like, go fuck yourself. Oh my god, I can't believe that you of all people are gonna chastise me on this. It's like the chain smoker, like being like, all right, put on your seatbelt. Like, man, fuck you. This is some bullshit. And it's also the danger, because like when you open the can of worms, both sides have to engage in it, or the side that doesn't will just lose, right? If one side is engaged in kind of these scummy tactics, the other side has to, or they'll just lose. And then that encourages the other side to then go a level deeper and a level deeper. And it's like, oh my god, it's just, it is really, really frustrating to deal with. And kind of dangerous too, because the incentive structure is all out of whack.
I was recently thinking about. I mean, there was a conversation that I think you and I and some other people were involved in a few months ago about the kind of like meta level discussion of Twitch conversations and like how to deal with somebody who keeps interrupting you and talking over you over and over again, right? Like that,
Yep.
the strategy of that kind of reminds me a lot of what you were saying about the Supreme Court thing, right? Because you can't just let them keep interrupting you and talking over you, but then like as soon as you do it, now you're engaging in the same bad behavior. It's
Yeah, and to use and to sort of analogize it back and forth, when it does get too bad, the person who steps in is the host, right? And Prime has sometimes done this where he'll like reset a panel, take an open panel private with select people. Who is the host though for the United States federal government? No one. So it just gets worse and worse and worse until it's like an absolute screaming match. And this is something that I think could be one of the most important consequences of the Biden administration is trying to reverse that trend, because it feels like since 2008 it's just gotten worse and worse and worse with each legislative term. And maybe pray to God we can get like. Although, God, fucking Romney really should have voted for this bill. God damn it. But trying to reverse that trend, I think, could be, if he's successful, could be one of, if not the most important thing in the Biden admin.
um So now I was thinking about like a European history thing, where it was often the case that that because there were several different like great powers that often had conflicting interests with each other, and if two of them are fighting and had to do some kind of negotiation, they would often just get one of the third ones to come in and kind of be an art, be
Yep.
a moderator, but between them, right? And so it was convenient to have six or seven that could conceivably do that to kind of arbitrate between two of their buddies. But yeah, I mean, I guess this is just one of the downsides of a two party system is that there is no third party that can arbitrate between them.
Well, I don't really think it's a flaw of the two-party system because I think there's a great deal of ideological diversity even within the parties, such that someone like AOC probably would be part of a third party with the same political positions if
Mm-hmm.
we lived in a three-party state. I think it's more a consequence of the fact that just everyone fucking hates each other and nothing can be neutral anymore, right? It's
But
like how the ACLU isn't just about like freedom of speech anymore; they're about like every progressive political issue because like everything has to be political about every single thing. Like nothing is allowed to be neutral anymore. Everything gets politicized into the fight. So there are no third parties anymore. There is everyone has picked a side. No one is in the middle.
yeah, I mean, I think I'm trying to like connect that to the analogy of like the early modern Europe, because I think everybody hated each other in early modern Europe too. So to me that doesn't seem like sufficient to dispel that analogy.
Well, it seems like
But it
I
was
guess the way I would put it,
multipolar rather than two
yes,
sided.
it feels like there are these two sides that are just like unanimously opposed to each other. I don't think that's a product of the two-party system. I think it's a product of the fact that we've gone through a great deal of social change in the last 10, 13 years. And they are the people that are very far left and they're the people that are very far right, and those people would probably filter out to different parties in a multi-party system,
Yeah.
but they would but there would still be much like there are multi-party systems, there would be the left-wing coalition and the right-wing coalition. And it feels like even if AOC and Joe Manchin were in different left-wing parties that formed a coalition, there still wouldn't be like a neutral third party, right? Because
Yeah.
that neutral third party that wouldn't be aligned with left or right. I mean, those people all get villainized by both sides. On the left, people like AOC tear apart, Cinema and Manchin and stuff like that, and say, these people are fucking traitors. We hate them. And on the right, they do the exact same thing when they look at like the Republican senators that voted to impeach Trump after January 6th. Those people are all getting axed out of the party, right? It feels like both the left and the right are becoming, just so united in their hatred of the other, and everyone picks a side. There is no like third option.
Yeah, I don't think a two-party system necessitates that everybody become that extremely polarized, but it has kind of resulted in that. I mean, I guess it's not. I'm not sure that a multi-party system would be necessarily any better. It's more just the fact that there's no like if England and France hate each other, they can just go go meet up in Switzerland and have them be, you know what I mean? It's just there's no equivalent of
Yeah.
that in the U.S. government, where if the Democrats and Republicans are at each other's throat, they don't have anyone that they can go,
Yep.
or like in the prime panel analogy, there's no prime. you
Yeah.
know
Yeah, that's what we need. We need Prime, Supreme Dictator for life.
we,
He can come
we
down. Dude, you imagine like Mitt Romney and AOC like yelling in like a joint session, and then Prime's like, "Excuse me," like he like mutes everyone on the Discord, like, "All right, we're gonna let this guy go. This guy, I need Alpha Hands gang to see them." that would be great.
I mean, like we've said before, like the way that we do primaries is already basically a prime panel, like when they do primary
Yeah.
debates. So
Oh
why not
man,
the
some of
Senate
those are
too?
just crazy. I don't know if you saw the clips from the Wyoming primary like a month or two back, because of course Liz Cheney is like public enemy number one in the Republican Party right now. So she's getting primaried by all these crazies that are talking about, and it was just so funny. It was like it would be like this compilation clip where the moderator would be like, COVID-19 vaccination, and go, Liz Cheney, we need to get vaccinated to protect our Americans, stay healthy, and I encourage everyone to get vaccinated. And then next person, the Fauci was working with Xi Jinping to cook this thing up in a lab. I tell you, it just like goes down the line, and it does with issue after issue. It'd be like, issue one, oh, reasonable take from Liz Cheney, and then three batshit insane takes. It just happened over and over and over again. Anyway, so I've got two more good articles here, and then I've got potentially a mini like podcast if we want to watch that. Talking about the actual Inflation Reduction Act here. So I think we'll start with this one that sort of just does an overview of like what it gets right and what it gets wrong, and then the second one dives into one of the big provisions in it, which talks about supply chains for rare earth minerals that are required for a lot of green tech that traditionally have always come from China. That's like a big criticism you hear. It's like, oh, solar panels use minerals mined by China who do so in like very environmentally damaging ways.
Okay.
All right, so from the Council on Foreign Relations, what the historic U.S. climate bill gets right and gets wrong, by Alice C. Hill, CFR expert, and Madeline Babin, August 10th, 2022. What major climate action is included in the Inflation Reduction Act? With its approval in the Senate and the anticipated passage by the House of Representatives, the Inflation Reduction Act 2022 is set to deliver the largest investment in climate action in U.S. history. Congress has directed nearly $370 billion over the next decade to rapidly scale up energy production and drive substantial reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. The historic legislation invests in a variety of efforts, including low-carbon technologies, environmental justice initiatives for disadvantaged communities, and tax credits to promote electric vehicle sales. The IRA pours $27 billion into creating a green bank to finance clean energy technology and emission-cutting infrastructure, such as residential rooftop solar panels. Billions more go to climate-smart agricultural practices and clean vehicle manufacturing facilities. Additional funding for consumer programs, including those that underwrite the use of heat pumps, which are energy-saving systems that help regulate house temperatures while improve home energy efficiency. The IRA also directs $1.5 billion to reduce methane leaks from natural gas production to support the U.S. commitment to the global methane pledge. On the resilient side, Congress will hand out $5 billion in grants to support fire-resilient forests, forest conservation, and urban tree planting. The bill also allocates several $billion in funding for drought resilience in western states. What doesn't it include? The bill focuses heavily on emission-cutting solutions to climate change and mostly neglects resilience. In its aim to make buildings more energy efficient, it misses an opportunity to make sure buildings will withstand the climate-fueled extremes that the nation is already experiencing and will continue to endure. Last year, climate events inflicted more than $152 billion in damages across the country. And this year, climate change has brought flash flooding in California, Kentucky, and Montana, as well as wildfires in Alaska, California, and New Mexico. Damn, wildfires in Alaska? Jesus Christ. Come on, guys. Jeez, what is it going to take?
Yeah, I mean, I guess lately they've been having like 100-degree plus temperatures in Canada and stuff. So yeah.
I hadn't even heard about wildfires last time. I'll look that up later. Yeah, and forest fires, those are like really bad because, stopping those, you only, forest firefighters like the Park Service, they will like, be on a station and they'll see some smoke, like half an hour after the fire's already been going and be like, oh, time to get out there, put on their packs and have to like hike for like an hour to get there. So those really get out of hand really quickly. It's why so much of forest firefighting work is prevention, where they'll do controlled burns so that when fires do inevitably happen, because they can't stop them, they don't go massively out of control, which is something that happened for a while. Previously the policy was if you see a fire, stop it, and they were able to stop the fires, but as a result, there was this huge buildup of deadwood. So then a fire did come through, and there was like, 50 years of, deadwood from trees and plants that had died, and it just went up like a tinderbox.
Yeah, I'm in California, which has wildfires all the time, and the last house I lived in, I had to evacuate twice because of wildfires.
Yeah, it's crazy how it's starting to just become like a normal thing in some areas of the country where it's like, oh, it's that time of summer, 2 weeks where the sky is gonna be like yellow because of all the smoke. Close up the windows, get one of the. My family, we get those like big box fans you put in the windows, and we put like one of those filters over them, and we just have it running inside. And at the end of 2 weeks, it's like soot black from like all the stuff that was just in the air. Yeah, it's crazy.
Like we're all
Anyway.
smokers now or something.
Yeah. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, predicts to increase hurricane activity in the coming months. When communities rebuild after disasters, they risk restoring structures doomed to fail in the next catastrophe since the United States lacks climate-resilient building codes. What are other concerns about the bill? Some measures, including the Inflation Reduction Act, could inadvertently harm U.S. climate efforts. For example, the bill includes a clean hydrogen tax credit, which is intended to help drive down the cost of hydrogen production. However, recent findings asterisk, have cast doubt on hydrogen's role in clean energy future. Scientists have found that hydrogen, which is prone to leaking, contributes to global heating when it escapes from the atmosphere. Using hydrogen to tackle climate change will require effective monitoring of leaks, but current technology only detects high enough amounts to cause explosions. Okay, before we go on, I want to see what this asterisk is. Oh my god, it's all the way at the bottom. Editor's note, author Alice D. Hill is on the board of the Environmental Defense Fund, which produced this report. Okay, good
Well,
note. Good job,
that's not what
CFI.
I expected it to say, but I thought it was
Yeah.
going to say something about the scientific findings on hydrogen.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought I was gonna be like, yeah, that's actually a bullshit study or something like that.
The
But no, it's just I guess it's just a bias noteworthy.
the thing about it leaking has been known for a long time. This is like why we're not very often using like hydrogen fuel cell technology for
Yep.
to power everything. Hydrogen is like
I
super
think you
abundant.
mean because the CIA keeps killing guys who invent water-powered cars, Cricket. Okay, I think that's what you mean.
Right. Kind of like how they're the people who have used weed to cure cancer. They're killing all of them too,
Yeah,
right?
that's unbelievable. The legislation also includes a provision that tethers offshore wind leasing to oil and gas extraction. Over a 10-year period, the Interior Department will be prohibited from issuing a lease for offshore wind development unless at least 60 million acres, the size of Michigan, Jesus Christ, has been leased for oil and gas in the previous year. The bill also requires the Interior Department to lease at least 2 million acres of public lands, more than double the size of Rhode Island. Okay, Rhode Island's tiny, guys. For oil and gas drilling as a prerequisite for any renewable energy development on public lands. Experts such as the Center for Biological Diversity's Brett Hartle have voiced concern that handcuffing renewable energy development to new oil and gas extraction will fan the flames of climate disasters torching our country. This Rhode Island one, I mean, Rhode Island's pretty small, but the size of Michigan every year, like, how many Michigans can you fit in the United States if you have to do a new one every year of lands that are oil? Especially because not the whole country is going to be, an area that wants to be that even can be leased for oil mining, or extraction, I would assume.
Yeah, I'm assuming this probably includes like renewing leases that are already being used for oil and
Yeah,
gas.
it's every for the next 10 years they have to issue a Michigan's worth of land to be mined for oil. That's 10 Michigan. Wait, can you even do that? I'm so curious.
I was just imagining the size of Michigan being leased the same land over and
Yeah,
over again for 10 years as opposed to like 10 Michigans, you know?
yeah. I'm just curious. How many 10 Michigans? What percentage of that is the United States as a whole?
I mean, Michigan's probably like an average sized state, so that would be like, 20% of the country or something like
Let's
that.
see. Let's see. Times that by 10. It's gonna be what? It's gonna be like nine, just short of a
Uh,
million.
uh,
So it's gonna. Yeah, it's almost a fourth of the country. What the fuck? Surely I'm missing something here,
yeah,
right? What?
I think they can't possibly mean that like the size of
Michigan's fucking
Michigan
over
in 10
60
separate
million acres.
parcels.
Michigan has leased for oil and gas in the It really says that though. Unless at least 60 million acres has been leased for oil and gas in the previous each year. Maybe it's something about the leases. Like when you lease 60 million acres, it's not actually going to be developed 60 million acres, so they can be leasing some of that same land. Because yeah, there's also no shot that oil and gas companies are going to be setting up operations in 60,000 acres, or 60 million acres like every year. Like that would be almost like that would be like a Dyson sphere level project if you're actually like making that much. I feel.
Yeah, there's no way. I mean, I think it just
Yeah.
must be the amount
Oh, I'd
of
be
the
curious to look
total
into
amount
that.
that's under lease each year or something.
Yeah, probably.
So that criticism of it makes a lot of sense to me. This seems like a little bit insane to tie renewable energy production to that.
Hmm.
Some of the there was a previous criticism of it that earlier in the article. I'm failing to remember exactly what it was, but it didn't make a lot of sense to me because it was like it wasn't saying that the bill did a bad thing. It was saying just that it didn't do something that they hoped it. I always hate when like people criticize a bill for not doing something.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean everyone wants to have their cake and eat it too.
Yeah.
Will the legislation lead to meaningful reductions of greenhouse gas emissions? Analysts predict that the IRA will result in a 41% reduction in U.S. emissions by 2030 compared to 2005 levels. Holy shit. Well, compared to 2005 levels, we're probably already, that 41% reduction, we're probably a lot of the way there, to be honest.
I hope so. I
Yeah.
guess.
Um, yeah, I'd actually be curious to see exactly. Because if they're saying by 2030, our levels are going to be 41% lower than 2005, well, how much are we already lower compared to 2005?
I would think like we've got to be, or else we're not going to make it there, right? Like, I wouldn't think that we could reduce it 41% between over the next 8 years, but
Let's see. Yeah, so it looks like as of 2020, we did have a bit of a drop off from COVID, and we're
Yeah,
still
it looks like
recovering.
we're maybe
It looks like
maybe like
we're probably like
25% down already or
yeah, it
something.
looks like we're about halfway, and then these are going to be different. This is going to be the model different impacts that the bill could have, whether it has a low, moderate, or high effect. So it looks like we would probably be about yeah, so it looks like this would probably be doubling our reduction. So that's really good. This is still a marked decrease here that is uniquely caused by the bill. Um, well, this would be an improvement from the projected 27% reduction that would happen regardless of the bill's passage. Yep, there we go. It falls short of Joe Biden's administration's commitment to reduce emissions by at least 50% by from 2005 levels to 2030. I mean, 41. I mean, you're basically there. You can round up at that point. However, additional federal regulatory action or increased state and local climate efforts could make up the difference. And the bill's provisions that lower clean energy costs and incentivize investment in renewables will alleviate some of the barriers that have deterred state and local action, which could galvanize the efforts needed to bridge the gap. This is actually a really important point that a lot of people don't realize, is that being the first adopter for something, it really sucks because, like, you have to deal with all the problems. But being that first adopter then opens up the door once those problems are ironed out for everyone else. It's actually really similar to the F-35. I don't know if you've followed any of like the saga of the F-35 boondoggle.
No.
It's the it's the United States military's newest fifth generation Air Force fighter, or sorry, just fighter. It's actually used by all three branches, and it was really criticized for being like a huge boondoggle and really expensive, and people compared it to the previous military jets that we had. And part of the reason why the per capita costs were so much higher was because we were still ironing out the kinks. We were still integrating it, and you also especially saw NATO allies not want the F-35 at first, wait, half a decade or so for the US to keep working on it and bring the prices down and then start adopting it. So it's super true. You can see a similar thing where the federal government is the first one that starts implementing electric cars. Electric cars are still new. We're still working out the kinks. The economy of scale hasn't ratcheted up. There are problems in 2.5 years when then the price of using these EVs continues to fall because first adopters have been working on it. Then you'll see everyone else switch over because at that point it just makes economic sense to do so.
Oh, this makes a lot of sense if I compare it to like the World War II economy, where the government was kind of propping up a lot of heavy industry and like automotive manufacturing especially, and then what you see like shortly after the war, the whole country becomes motorized and filled with highways, basically.
Yep. Yeah, it's the technology has so much potential, but it hasn't been realized yet, and you need people to be willing to take on the negative trade now, so that the technology improves to be a positive trade, and then everyone will take it up, and then we all get the benefits. That's a super. That's the thing that happens a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Um, will improve the United States' global image. The IRA will go a long way towards restoring the United States' credibility as a global leader on climate. As the largest emitter historically and the second largest emitter currently, the United States faces skepticism as it urges other nations to act on climate. By effectively demonstrating the plan to fulfill climate commitments, the IRA will strengthen U.S. legitimacy in international climate negotiations when nations convene in November for the 27th Conference of the Parties,
Man,
COP27.
like I want that to be true and I want it to actually matter, but I'm a little bit skeptical about like how much does that actually matter when they're doing the international negotiations.
I, sorry, go ahead.
Like if the idea is, yeah, I don't know. It's as if people think that China and India are just saying like, no, we're not going to reduce our emissions because you didn't, and that as if they'll just not find another reason or something, you know?
Yeah. When it comes to China and India, that's really true. The reality is these are developing economies. The way you develop an economy is by doing a bunch of fucked up shit to your environment, at least as it appears now, to industrialize. What is really true is that it does give us a lot of leverage with other developed nations. So places like Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, places like that. Southeast Asia countries that are further along in their development, like like Indonesia or Vietnam.
Most of those places
That
are already ahead of us in renewable energy, though, aren't they?
They are ahead of us, but it still gives us legitimacy to push for further measures because there absolutely is an attitude, similar to how in America we have people say, well, why should we do it if China isn't going
Yeah.
to? There are Europeans that are like, okay, we're trying, but like, listen, Denmark is really a small country in the grand scheme of things compared to America, so we don't want to be significantly handicapping ourselves. It's actually very similar to denuclearization, where if you can get everyone to commit to handicapping yourselves together, there is an underlying like, okay, we might be opposed us geopolitically, but none of us want a nuclear war. We might all be opposed, geopolitically, but none of us want, a climate disaster to, cost us trillions of dollars in the coming decades.
It seems like kind of a reversal of the negotiation dynamic with denuclearization, though, right? Because with denuclearization, the idea is like you don't want to leave one party with a bunch of nuclear weapons that the other side feels like they need to counter. So like it's perceived to be like advantageous to be the only one with nuclear weapons like against disarmed opponents. But with this, it seems like you don't want to be the last one to act or something like that, right? Like everyone feels justified. Like, I guess what they have in common is everyone feels justified in doing the thing because everyone else is doing it. Like that they have in common. But then it's like a different dynamic with the scaling back. Whereas like suppose everyone except China were to take like some this kind of climate action, then that would probably like that would make them look really bad as opposed to like what happens with the denuclearization. Do you get what I mean?
Yeah, I see what you mean. I think actually it's true in both scenarios where there's a very like hard interest in not taking this action. You don't want to get rid of your nuclear weapons because you don't want to handicap yourself nuclearly. You don't want to potentially sabotage your own economy because that's bad for your economy compared to the others. But then there's also this underlying pressure of, we all understand that this is, something that we don't want to happen, and you can't really look bad. Never underestimate the ability of soft power, right? That's the lesson the Soviet Union had to learn the hard way, and it's a lesson that, fingers crossed, China is starting to have to learn, where everyone fucking hates China now. So I think in both cases, there's a hard interest. I don't want to sabotage our economy. I don't want to get rid of our nukes. But then there is a soft interest going the other way. I don't want to be the one guy that isn't getting rid of my nukes. I don't want to be the one guy that isn't doing climate change.
For sure that makes sense on the climate change thing, but I think with the nukes, you would want to be the one person who isn't getting rid of your nukes if you could, right?
Well, you would from the sense of you wouldn't want to have your nukes, but in the same way that if everyone else is doing climate change stuff and you're not, that reflects badly. It is also true that if everyone else is getting rid of your nukes and trying to, take efforts to prevent nuclear holocaust, and you're the one guy that's not, that also makes you look bad.
I guess it makes you look bad, but it also I mean, you get what like having a nuclear arsenal when nobody else does gives you a kind of crazy leverage in that no one else has, and I just don't.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's a much different greater of scale. Oh, I've hampered my economy at the risk of not wanting to look bad. That's okay. Oh, I've given up our nukes at the risk of not wanting to look bad. That seems like a really like misplaced impact calculus. But I think that's actually evidence to the fact that there's a good chance for us to be able to do that if we're able to overcome the threat of nuclear war with soft power and everyone's shared fear of this. Then I think as more and more people across the world, especially young people, start to rank climate change as one of the most important issues, then you can see a similar thing. We're only a couple of decades out from significant portions of like the governments of the most powerful countries in the world being made up of kids who grew up thinking, oh my god, these boomers are going to destroy the planet. And when that happens, there's gonna be some whiplash.
Yeah, I mean, people said the same thing a few decades ago, right? Because there was a big environmental movement already going back to the 1960s, and it kind of, I don't want to say it didn't materialize at all. I mean, there has been an increasing concern about those things since that time, but I think. I don't know. Like I'm a little bit wary of that kind of prediction just because I've seen it fail before. But
I think the difference is that it feels like those previous environmentalism concerns were about a lot of times environmentalism generally as to a specific phenomena like climate change that could risk the planet. And I think with those other things, I mean, we took a lot of action, whether it's, the ozone layer. We had like I think it's the Kyoto protocols. We actually had previous emission reduction protocols as well. The EPA, obviously, with Nixon. Whereas it feels like the younger generation is basically like, yeah, we aren't getting anything. And it's not just environmentalism generally. It's like, a lot of young people are actually, think that climate change is going to be way worse than it actually. I mean, it'll be awful. Don't get me wrong. But it's not going to like destroy the world. But I think there's a significant portion of young people that do think like the world is going to end. And that's obviously not all young people, but I just think it's reflective of they take this concern, I think, a lot more like seriously. Like I think, and you're seeing even as young people continue to like mature into like the young 20s, climate change still ranks as like one of their, if not the top issue, pretty consistently. And you're starting to see this across the world.
Yeah, so I guess it makes sense if you look at the previous generation's environmental efforts as a partial success, and I think like especially on the ozone layer thing, you're totally right. That used to be like a really big concern, and it has been mostly addressed. And then if you look at
Yeah, I don't know if you saw the Matt Walsh tweet that was like a couple weeks ago. That was like, remember when they talked to us about the ozone layer, and then everyone stopped talking about it, and nothing happened, and there were like a million replies like, "Dude, it's because we fixed it." It's like all these articles about like the massive effort like that these world treaties went through to fix the ozone layer.
yeah, that ties back to like when we were watching the 2008 documentary, and you remember we had this conversation about like if you successfully prevent a crisis, like you might be viewed less
Yes.
sympathetically than if you had failed to prevent the same crisis. But
Yeah, it's like you say a crisis is happening. Oh my God, it's gonna be so bad. We need to do something. You do something, nothing happens. People are like, yeah, we told you were overblowing it. It's like you want to like tear your hair. Like, oh my God.
right. Whereas if you instead do nothing and fail to prevent the crisis, then you get to be the one that says, "I told you so." But
Yeah, it actually reminds me. Yeah, sorry, finish your thing. I'll look at the video.
yeah.
Just real quick.
So what I was gonna say was, if you view the previous generation's environmentalism as a partial success, then you could say like the next generation is gonna want to build on that success, and if you have enough partial successes, you do actually make some progress.
Yeah, it just reminds me this guy. I think it's RDC World. He does like these funny skits. Okay, yes, I don't own a home. I don't live in Washington. Please stop sending me this advertisement. All right. Hold on. Yeah, that's just real quick. That's just a really funny.
Keep making every movie more confusing.
Hey, all right, guys. People are dying right now. There's like toxins in the air, pollution. People are choking. We need y'all help right now.
Oh my God.
Wasn't that shooter?
And
was
the
standing up
monkey.
there?
I was
Yeah,
so
that's what
funny.
I'm talking about. Hey, I just said people are dying right now.
Like there's red particles falling from the sky.
Yes.
And like people are just like falling over.
Exactly. Right.
Oh, that's early.
Yeah,
That
it
is
is
pretty
early.
early. I thought it happened like 45 minutes.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah, man,
Hey, what are y'all talking about? My family's dying right now. Come on, please.
that's
he
why-
said it.
that's why he
it.
cares.
No, they only care
Hey,
about what's there.
you didn't read that article in 1999 where it said if we don't stop doing it to the climate, people are gonna die?
I mean, no,
I gotta print it out right here. Hey, read it now.
What the?
Read it now. Hey, what about his from 2005? What about his from 2015?
What is it?
And then we wrote a whole book. We wasted our time in 2022.
What the fuck?
Y'all didn't read none of that, huh?
Hey,
Yeah, it's too late now. You know when you could help? You know when you could help? In 1999 when I wrote the article. Well, that's the past. This is now. Carbon footprint too big. No, ozone layer's being depleted. Sorry, guys. There's ice caps are gone, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, there's no more animals.
No.
Oceans are gone.
Yes.
Yeah, you guys fucked up this time.
man,
You know it's on
sky
you.
is red.
Oh, actually, no lie. I have a plan.
What? Yeah, cool.
We made these masks.
Yeah,
We
that's
made these
right.
masks. We now we're fighting wars. We made these masks for us and our family, but y'all didn't fund them, so we did it with our own money. This is all we can make.
Okay, we'll make. Give us some more money.
We'll take that. So give it to us in about 10 minutes, and we'll start making them.
Okay, cool. Hey, production process and
But too
everything.
bad y'all didn't be dead in like 4 seconds.
4 seconds. What are you talking
Yeah, because the toxins are coming through the...
Okay, give us the masses. Give us the masses.
Oh,
Come on.
hey, those walls that y'all making at the last second, those were good, man. Good shit.
Give us the masses.
It's above us, guys. Yeah, we gotta watch that again. Watch it again. Hey, there's nobody at the movies, guys. I know, everything went right over my head.
Yep.
Yeah, it's just exactly the problem. It almost reminds me of like Noah's Ark. I think you make a great biblical appeal, which is like, listen, no one is gonna pay attention to the problem before it happens, but by the time the waves start rolling up, it's way too late. Anyways, let's see. I think we were right here. While setbacks to the administration's climate agenda have, quote, slowed the pace, end quote, of other countries' emission reduction efforts, a U.S. climate envoy, John Kerry, has said the United States' passage of the biggest climate legislation in its history could inspire other countries to take action to avoid falling behind. Are there any challenges to rolling out the legislation? Because the IRA has a decade-long time span, the risk remains that changes in the administration could slow climate investment. Still, since this is a congressional act, not an executive order, it will require legislative or judicial action to undo, thus making it harder to reverse. In addition, courts will likely be less sympathetic to any claims that federal rulemaking pursuant to the bill violates the major questions doctrine, recently articulated by the Supreme Court in West Virginia versus EPA. Ensuring that the IRA's
Can we
funding...
look real
Sorry, go
quickly
for
at
it.
what is the major questions doctrine?
Yeah, let's see. Just have a link right here. People was a conservative majority ruled the EPA's ability to regulate carbon emissions. The Parsec in 36 decision, the court ruled that the Clean Power Plan established... Sorry, excuse me. I think some of those toxins are coming down a little early. Sorry about that. In the 6-3 decision, the court ruled that the Clean Power Plan established under the Barack Obama administration went beyond the EPA's regulatory mandate. Specifically, the EPA had exceeded congressional authority by pushing utilities to make system-wide moves away from coal power generation towards cleaner forms of electricity production, such as wind and solar energy.
Okay, so it's just, I guess it's not even explaining this unless we read the whole article or something, so never mind.
Hold on, there's a thing here. Major question doctrine delegates authorities to agencies to regulate particular aspects of society in general or broad terms. However, a number of decisions has declared that if an agency seeks to decide an issue of major national significance, its action must be supported by clear statutory authorization. Courts, commentators, and Supreme Court justices have referred to this doctrine as the major questions doctrine or major rules doctrine, though the court has never used the term in a majority of opinion. This info spreads an overview of the major questions doctrine discusses. Okay, so it's basically the idea of like, how you'll sometimes hear conservatives complain that the ATF can make laws by redefining what an assault weapon is. What the court is saying is that's fine, as long as it's not some crazy important shit. If it's something like, the future of the nation, you can't just have an agency, decide that willy-nilly. You have to get clear statutory mandates from Congress. The Congress needs to be passing a law that specifically tells us what to do there, if it's a big enough question, which seems like, how do you even determine what that
yeah, I
is?
was about to say,
whatever.
it seems like I
I
hope they have some kind of guidelines for what counts as a major question, or else, otherwise this is just, I don't know.
Yeah. Huh. Anyways, ensuring that the Inflation Reduction Act's funding goes to initiatives that actually help combat climate change will pose a challenge. For example, though the bill allocates billions of dollars to support climate-smart agriculture, critics have warned that some of the target programs could do more harm than good by funding projects that increase emissions by incentivizing land clearing, fertilizer use, and intensive animal breeding. So that is this article. So, sounds like mostly good, but you can definitely see where some of the compromises were made.
Yeah, if we actually have 10 Michigans worth of land being leased out...
There's no way. There's no way. There surely isn't enough fucking land with oil in it. That's,
Yeah.
like, you tell me 25% of America is like good for like oil drilling? There's no shot.
Yeah.
Anyways. Alright, what do we have? Alright, and then I'm gonna open a bunch of so then here we go. This is the next specific one talking about a big bet at alternate mineral supply chains. So this is a sort of preamble. My understanding of this issue is that a lot of green energies require rare earth minerals, REMs, which is a series of specific kind of minerals. I believe it's a categorization on the periodic table that are really rare. And for a long, long time, we've just gotten these almost exclusively from China, where they just do some pretty horrible shit to dig it up. Where they'll literally dump acid on hills that will melt dirt and rock, but not the minerals, and then they'll scoop it up. It's quite literally sometimes what they do. And that's definitely a fair concern. Previously, I had always sort of thought that that's bad, but we need to distinguish between environmentalism generally and climate change. If you had to, pollute a river, for example, to fix climate change, that's totally worth it. Because polluting a river is just generic environmentalism damage, whereas climate change is a specific phenomena that appears to be fundamentally affecting the planet on a vast scale. Whereas environmentalism generally, there is theoretically a type of crisis that could emerge if you affected enough of the environment, right? For example, the bioweb, a critical death of diversity. There's theorized that this could lead to a chain reaction where it's the classic thing where it's an environment is all tied in, so you remove one species, then that entire environment is affected. The idea is, well, what if then that environment affects another environment, So it might be we kill off 10% of the Earth's species, which then kills off the species that rely on that 10%, which then kills off the species that rely on that group, and it goes and goes and goes. So we definitely have to be cognizant of those phenomena, but just generic environmental damage, obviously I don't like it, but if that's what it takes to stop climate change, climate change is way more important. And in the I believe it's in the Inflation Reduction Act, there's either a credit for, or there might even be a strict requirement, or a credit for not using rare earth minerals from countries that are either outside of America or that America has a free trade deal with. This bill actually does do a really awesome thing where it says it either needs to be from America or a country that we've got a free trade deal with. So that actually is a major sort of like caveat to this, having to do it in America. Because I know, for example, particularly, I think it's Australia has a ton of mining for this kind of stuff as well, although it's mostly coal. But I know people have theorized about potentially Australia opening up their rare earth mineral sector as a result of this more so. Anyways, the Inflation Reduction Act places a big bet on alternative mineral supply chains by Reed Blakemore and Patty Ryan. The Unexpected Inflation Reduction Act proposes, among numerous other climate provisions, consumer tax credits for EV purchases. The credits aim to make EVs more affordable, but the greatest impact lies in the requirement that a proportion of the battery minerals in qualifying vehicles must have been extracted or processed in the United States or free trade partner countries. EV consumer tax credits will increase producer demand of the new sources of battery metals to capitalize on the provision. The credits, therefore, tie the future of domestic EV sales to investments in alternate mineral supply chains. The underdevelopment of battery metal supply chains remains a liability for EV development in the United States. Critical minerals, including lithium, cobalt, nickel, manganese, and graphite, have value chains rife with underinvestment, political risk, and poor governance. Diversification of battery supply chains is crucial, and the Inflation Reduction Act provides a needed investment signal for this through its EV consumer tax credit mechanism. Under the Act, vehicles are only eligible for the credit if final assembly occurs within North America and no critical minerals are sourced from a foreign entity of concern, including China and Russia. The tax credit is then split in half based on two further conditions. One, a percentage of the battery metal must be extracted or processed in the United States or in a partner country with a free trade agreement, or sourced from the material cycle in North America. And two, a proportion of the battery components must be manufactured in North America, period. The supply chain incentives for EV manufacturers are clear. The consumer demand generated for buyers looking to capitalize on the tax credit would provide a strong signal for manufacturers to invest in and secure alternatively sourced materials. Yet the incentive becomes moot if the preponderance of automakers are unable to meet these requirements. This sets a highly ambitious target for alternative mineral supplies, with a provision designed to incentivize domestic EV deployment. The tax's initial 40% battery sounding requirement would increase to 80% by 2027. Raising the output from domestic and foreign mineral supply chains is a central objective of the credit. Yet, the pace at which the share of qualifying mineral supply is required to increase over a 5-year period is remarkable given the current availability of such resources within the United States and FTA jurisdictions. This is particularly true of upstream extraction, where substantial new supply will still need to be brought online despite significant political and regulatory challenges, particularly in the United States. Even discontinuing permitting, new mines may take up to a decade to be brought into production, and a $7,500 consumer credit might be insufficient to summon the massive upfront capital required for new projects given the current average EV consumer price of $66,000. However, such obstacles are not insurmountable. There are several provisions currently in the text that can be refined to enable the Inflation Reduction Act's goal of accelerating supply chain activity while expanding the availability of low-cost EVs. First, the Act's inclusion of processing alongside extraction may alleviate the increasing stringency of sourcing requirements between 2023 and 2027. Processing facilities can be built far quicker than new mines, ensuring a strong demand signal for new upstream capacity in the United States and FTA partners. This can support the development of a full-cycle alternative supply chain beyond 2027 while allowing shorter-term relief from the rapid pace of new sourcing requirements. Second, the inclusion of FTA countries as qualifying sources of mineral supply suggests room to consider several other like-minded partner countries. Formulating the right trusted partnership model will be crucial in building a supply chain which can support U.S. leadership in EV production while also deconcentrating and therefore de-risking the EV battery supply chain. The United States and FTA countries together may still struggle for account for the entirely mineral demand within the broader EV industry, both in terms of quantity and the type of mineral. Argentina, for example, a top 5 global producer of lithium, does not have a free trade agreement with the United States. Japan, which is set to become a major player in midstream process, would also be excluded. To support a robust alternative mineral supply chain, the sourcing provisions of the tax credit should consider numerous multilateral and bilateral partnerships necessary to make the global supply chain possible, many of which do not include a free trade agreement. Codifying a means to evaluate these sui generis relationships presents an opportunity to aggregate efforts within Congress administration, where partnerships such as the Mineral Security Partnership, the Energy Resource Governance Initiative, and other nascent bilateral partnerships already exist.
Sui generis, in case anybody doesn't know, it means like the only one of its kind.
Yeah. I think this is a really interesting subject because I think it's like one of the only good arguments against free trade, which is that when you spread these global supply chains out, there is a risk that a supply chain that is, one of a kind or very low in quantity can be uniquely fragile to geopolitical intertanglement, right? The classic example is like Nord Stream and Nord Stream 2 in Europe, where right now a huge back and forth between, Europe wanting to support Ukraine against Russia is the fact that they are really reliant on Russian gas.
Mm-hmm.
A similar argument could be made for some of the supply chains for medical equipment from China during COVID-19. This didn't actually happen, as far as I'm aware, but there was a real concern that China might just be like, yeah, we're not going to send you any masks, or stuff like that. And that was a really big concern for a while. Of course, these things do go both ways. Russia's economy is currently being absolutely demolished almost in its entirety right now because of the sanctions, and them cutting off one of their biggest exports is a huge risk. And it's the same thing with China. People often talk about, oh, China could just cut us off from trade at any moment. The minute they do that, there's going to be some of the greatest social unrest China's experienced in a long time, because their economy is also incredibly dependent on ours. So it's sort of a mutually shared vulnerability, which on the one hand, some people would say the exact opposite. That's actually a good thing because it means we can't go to conflict with each other. But not always. And it means that when we do go to conflict, it will be very devastating economically on top of, whatever the other impacts are. As we have seen in Europe right now, with energy prices incredibly high. Not just because of, inflation from all the pent-up demand from COVID, but because of all the sanctions on Russia.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you were saying that's one of the arguments against free trade, and it sounds like a mix of arguments for and against, right?
It's the argument against would specifically be that this is an intolerable vulnerability, but some people would actually say no, it's actually good to prevent like even greater conflict. The
Yeah.
question is, which is a really interesting question. Like the question is like, would it be better if Russia didn't have nukes, because then we could invade Russia and like stop them from going to Ukraine at all? And so to some people they'd be like, invading Russia sounds like a bad thing actually. But other people would be like, it might sound bad to you, but it doesn't sound so bad to all the countries next to Russia who already have to tolerate all this and crazy shit. Like, it doesn't sound that bad to Ukrainians right now. That's like the question that goes back and forth.
Yeah. So I find it interesting also how all of this stuff in the article kind of plays into the conflict you were pointing out earlier, where you were saying like certain types of environmental damage might be worth it if there were if we were able to fight climate change because of it. And in this case, it seems like I was about to say we're almost going in the opposite direction, but it's not quite that, right? But I mean, I guess it sounds like the part of this legislation is purposely meant to avoid engaging with particular parts of the rare earth mineral trade, presumably because of the other kinds of environmental damage that are I mean, maybe that's one of the reasons that are occurring in those countries as part of this mining process, right? But then theoretically, if if that restricts the market too much, then you could end up harming the market for electric vehicles and making climate change worse, so as to fight this like mining operation.
Yeah, it's a very delicate balance. There's something they mentioned up here about how introducing, it talks about right here, being able to quickly put up processing facilities in the locally would then signal strong demand for new upstream capacity, which would incentivize people to make the mines. Right? The idea is, making the mines is really risky, so people are not likely to do it. But if we have an explosion of facilities that process minerals from mines, well, then that is a reassuring signal that it's much less risky for the mines now, because they're not just buying into like a small economy. Lots of other people are invested into it, so it makes the idea that this could just go belly up instantly much less likely, right? It's like the difference between like buying at Walmart, which is a very trusted brand safe type thing, versus like some random like a corner store down the street.
Yeah, it seems like a big gamble, right? It's like high risk, high reward. Because obviously the best case scenario is like now we've got this whole big new domestic industry producing batteries and electric vehicles, and obviously that would be great. And then the worst case scenario is instead it like kills the market for electric vehicles because our domestic industry isn't able to keep up, and we can't compensate for it anymore with imports.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and more specifically, that there could be a real sort of like wasted potential, where all these companies that want to invest in green tech decide, okay, we're going to be setting up stuff within the supply chain of America or free trade agreement countries. They do that, those countries aren't currently chosen for economic reasons, because it's more effective to do it outside. And as a result, this tax credit isn't enough to bring them back up to be within competition. And then these companies all shut down. And all that time and resources that could have been invested into getting EVs, sure, it sucks that they're in China, but they're still EVs. Now, it tried to do EVs and failed, and they basically did nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's like the world where these EVs invest into the already existing EV infrastructure across the world outside of America, free trade agreement countries, versus the world where they try to do it in America and it blows up in their face, and then they don't do anything.
Yeah. And then if it fails, then it makes the that type of policy look bad for other countries, and it yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm looking up right now, like who do we have free trade agreements with, and it's 20 countries. So it's Australia, Bahrain, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Israel, Jordan, Mexico, Morocco, Nicaragua, Oman, Panama, Peru, Singapore, and South Korea. So like 10% of the world or something, basically.
Yeah. South Korea could be really big. They have a huge market for manufacturing like advanced advanced materials. I don't know if that is involved with silicon. I just know that there's been this huge explosion in South Korea over the last couple of decades, especially with their defense industry, which is starting to become like the number two to America in terms of like the greatest like defense industry in the world.
Yeah, and then on this list also Australia, Canada, Mexico. Those are all big mining countries.
Yeah, those are quite significant.
Yeah, and like a couple of these other ones, like I don't really know enough about their economy. Like I wouldn't be surprised if Morocco is a big mining country, but I don't know if that's the case. But...
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny in this article they mentioned Japan, the fact we don't have a free trade agreement. It's just so tragic. If we could have gotten TPP, I'm just reminded, if we could have gotten, oh my gosh, it would have been so good.
Yeah, I was thinking this.
Especially because Japan themselves have a huge amount of free trade agreements with other countries, meaning that, and I don't know the exact provision in terms of like, does it count as being from a country if that country gets it from another country? But certainly it's probably going to be at least some degree. That would just open up so much of the world. If it comes into Japan, it counts, then that would open up so many other countries that Japan has free trade agreements with, because a huge amount of Japan's foreign policy is integrating economic zones. It's why they have such a great economy that blew up in like the 90s and stuff. It's funny, I think a lot of young people today don't realize the degree to which people talked about Japan in the past the way people talk about China now, as this rising economy that's going to overtake the United States. I mean, definitely some significant differences in terms of the geopolitical ramifications, no doubt. But yeah, if we desperately need a free trade agreement with Japan, it would be such a benefit, especially in this added context of the IRA.
Yeah, and TPP was also meant to shore up a lot of Southeast Asia against Chinese influence as well.
Yep, and tie them into our sphere of influence instead of the other way around, which is what has happened now, where when we say, oh, we're not going to let you import things from China, China says, okay, we're going to construct it to 99% completion, ship it to a Southeast Asian country, they get to finish it and send it to you. And now the Southeast Asian country is like, wow, thanks, China. We love this added economic benefit. And it does the exact opposite of what we should be doing. It's just so pants on head. Stupid. Thirdly, clarification is needed about the blanket ban on inputs from, quote, foreign entities of concern, end quote, particularly China. The Act prescribes a tax credit for any vehicle whose critical minerals were extracted, processed, or recycled in China, and may inadvertently negate the other provisions of the tax credit. Given China's dominance throughout the global critical mineral supply chain, the total exclusion of raw material sourced from China from reaching midstream processing would effectively place access to the credit almost entirely on upstream extraction. Moreover, the provision would also demand that any free trade agreement or partner country processor that would otherwise allow an automaker to qualify for the credit demonstrate a total separation from the Chinese supply chain, which would require a traceability regime unlikely to reach maturity for some time. The final legislation should therefore consider whether adopting a similar scaled reduction in inputs from foreign entities of concern will allow supply chains to adjust over time while still suffering the goal of a robust, resilient, and secure EV industry. Ultimately, the Inflation Reduction Act is a significant first step to creating a consumer demand for signal for mineral-secure EVs, but requires accompanying support for investment in the new supply. Currently, investment is impeded not by a lack of confidence in future mineral demand, but by uncertainty surrounding the gap between final investment decisions and the pathway for possible returns, reflecting political, regulatory, and economic risk in the effort to challenge existing and dominant producers. Therefore, the critical next step in this effort is a U.S. and multilateral strategy on extraction and processing for supply chains to develop at the ambitious pace envisioned by the provision. Without this, the onus to meet these provisions may fall too strongly on automakers, disunifying efforts to stake the United States leadership in an electrified future.
I'm kind of mulling over that last paragraph there. The critical next step in the effort is U.S. and multilateral strategy on extraction and processing for supply chains to develop the ambitious pace envisioned in the provision. So they're worried about putting too much of a burden on automakers, and so it sounds like I don't know. I guess it's not entirely clear to me how they. I don't even know how to like word the thing that I'm trying to say, because it seems like this didn't really spell out any the particular involvement of anyone other than automakers and the people that are directly involved in their supply chains. So I guess I'm confused about like why did it say that they're worried about the onus falling too strongly on automakers, but like who else is it going to fall on? I don't quite get that.
I think when they talk about the U.S. and multilateral strategy, it needs to be the kind of thing where you get, 2 or 3 major countries that are in free trade agreements that could be sourcing for these minerals all on the same page when we say like we need to be signaling to industry leaders and stuff like, hey, we need to go about this in this way. Because we obviously live in a capitalist society, but there's still a lot of dialogue between industry leaders and the government on exactly what this policy means and how we want to see it shaped out. So I think a big part of this is trying to make sure that it's not just automakers going to the mineral processors who are then going to the mineral to mines or people that want to open new mines, but that it is spread out, that we're reaching out to all parties. I think that's what they're getting at when they say we need to also open up more of these processing facilities. Is that if you want like an operation with, if you want the supply chain, if you want to create a new parallel supply chain, that is going to require all parts of the chain to be coming up sort of in tandem. In a normal supply chain, there's enough normally when a supply chain emerges, there's enough economic incentive already for these to be emerging. But when we're specifically just trying to create a parallel one to one that exists, there's a real risk of, we are ready to make the cars, with a 20% tax credit. We're ready to process the minerals, but then the third party is like, we're not ready to mine. Where every step of the way you need to be, they mentioned this earlier, they're talking about the traceability regime. You need like, the chain is only as strong as the weakest link, and there's a real worry that there's going to be a huge imbalance in the strength of each link.
Okay, so then when they said the onus to meet these provisions, they're not just talking about like the carrying out the provisions. They're talking about also the like planning and setting up the traceability regime.
Exactly, I think so. Yeah.
So
because even if an automaker says, yeah, we want to make our EVs like this, so we get the massive tax credit, the EVs, the companies are then going to go talk to the mineral processors and be like, all right, give us all the rare earth minerals we need, but they can't be from China. And the processors are going to be like, we cannot do that. We literally cannot do that.
Right, but then
be like, oh shit.
But then this law is going to facilitate that in a way that, okay.
Yeah.
All right, now it makes sense.
I think that's what they're talking about in terms of the support. They're worried that the law won't be doing enough to make sure that every part of the supply chain comes online at the same time with relative strength and parity.
Okay, all right.
But yeah, I'm a little worried when it says this is a great step, but we need more. I don't know if we're going to be getting any more to Congress here.
Yeah, we're
Atlantic
not.
Council. Hopefully, a lot of this stuff seems like, and hopefully it is the case that a lot of the stuff is stuff that you don't really need congressional authority to do. This could be stuff that like the agencies that are handling this regulation, when the bill says, it can't. Foreign entities of concern. That's the kind of phrase that's going to give like an executive agency a lot of leeway to then like straighten out the edges. So that way, you don't have like Congress in session for like 5 months, like listening to different experts on like the little nitty gritty. Like they set like a pretty broad, but like a specific but decently broad goal, and then they let the executive agency actually carry that out. And particularly when we talk about the multilateral stuff, that's also something that the executive could really be handling in terms of diplomatic channels and reaching out to industry leaders and contexts and stuff like that. This is actually, arguably, this is why it's actually kind of desirable to have a working relationship between like Washington and like big energy or big tech or stuff like this, is so they can be like, hey, this is what we're doing. We need to make sure we get you guys on board so this doesn't blow up in everyone's face. So let's get this ball rolling now.
Yeah, that makes sense. And to your earlier point about like that we may not be able to get any more legislation on this. one thing about this legislation is that if it does work out the way they planned, it could create kind of a snowball effect where the electric vehicle industry has enough incentive to continue building on
their
itself
own.
and
Which is so huge.
right. So that may partially obviate the need for more legislation on the same front.
Yeah, it actually makes me curious. I'm wondering if let me just look this up. So the Inflation Reduction Act is a reconciliation bill, and normally you only get one of these per year. Technically, you can get 3 per year, but each of them has to separately deal with the budget, the spending, and the deficit. So typically, they just roll those into one and do one a year. But it was last year that the Senate parliamentarian determined that you could pass 2 in a year if one was set to effect the next financial year. So you only get 1 a year, but if you have one for 2020 and one for 2021, you can pass the one that's for 2021 in 2020, as long as can be sufficiently determined that this is about 2021. So I'm just wondering, is this the last? Have they already done one for 2022 and this is for 2023, or could they theoretically use that trick to get another reconciliation bill through this year? Is what I'm wondering.
So okay, suppose they do a bill for 2022. They do another one that's supposed to affect 2023. Would that mean that they can't do another one for 2023, or could they just do 2 every year, or is it
no? So if you do one for 2020, if you do one in 2022 and then a second one in 2022 that's for 2023, you can't do one in 2023.
Okay, so we're borrowing one from the next year.
Yeah, we're going into reconciliation deficit. Let's see. Yeah, at April 2021, the Senate parliamentarian, an in-house rules expert, determined the Senate could pass 2 budget reconciliation bills in 2021. One focused on fiscal year 2021 and one focused on 2022. So I guess maybe this was a one-time thing. In addition, the Senate could pass additional budget reconciliation bills by describing them as a revised budget resolution that contains budget reconciliation instructions. However, the parliamentarian later clarified that the auto discharge rule allows a budget resolution to bypass a budget committee vote and be brought directly to the Senate floor does not apply to a revised budget resolution. God, why are our rules like this? As a result of this ruling, a revised budget resolution would need to be approved by a majority vote of the budget committee before proceeding to the Senate floor, or deadlocked with a tied vote and then brought to the Senate floor via a motion to discharge in a 50-50 Senate where committees are evenly divided between even parties. This has the functional effect, okay, thank you, of requiring at least one member of the minority party on the budget committee to present in order to provide a quorum for vote. Considering the inherent partisan nature of reconciliation legislation, is highly unlikely that a member of the minority party will cooperate with the majority by providing a quorum on the committee, thus practically limiting the majority of a 50-50 tied summit to 1 reconciliation bill per fiscal year. Okay, so never mind. So we are donezo until the midterms, and then we roll into 2023.
Yeah, so I guess that's a thing that might matter to some future Congress, but not to this one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I'm curious if the reason they said this for 2021 was for COVID or something specifically, because I'm just wondering, does that rule not apply forever now? I'm super curious.
I don't even know. I mean, I know the House redoes their rules every time they have a new session, but
No.
but I think the same thing is not true for the Senate. So I don't know.
Yeah, the House is also really weird. I genuinely did not know this. I only learned this the other day. Did you know that the House has not been reproportioned to the population since the 1920s or something?
Wait, what? What do you mean?
Yeah. So the House is supposed to be the one that actually represents population, right?
You're saying because they haven't increased the number of House members? Is that
yes.
Right? Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
so I did know that.
Yeah. What is that bullshit? I can't. This is another thing where it's I can't believe you want to change the system, motherfuckers. We don't get the big benefit we're supposed to get, which is that the House should be almost unwinnable for Republicans as it currently exists. If we're going to be going along the thing where it's supposed to be off population,
well, no,
it's crazy.
No, but they do reassign. They do
they reassign the seats, but they don't increase the amount of seats, which is something they had always done up until the year they stopped doing it. And the reason they stopped doing it is just because they couldn't agree. They literally couldn't agree and said, okay, we can't agree this time. We're approaching a borderline constitutional crisis, so we're just going to set this to this we're going to renew the old one with an auto renewal, and we'll fix this later. Fast forward like 90 years into the future, and it has just become the de facto thing where the House of Representatives never increases, even though that was supposed to be part of the power of big states. Is that, yeah, if a state keeps getting bigger and bigger as the population increases, we're going to assign more seats to it.
No, they do. They just haven't increased the total number of seats in the House of Representatives.
Yes. But it's still the same total number. So there's a limiting factor in terms of the ratio, right? Like theoretically, if we had still been increasing it, smaller states or bigger states would be getting an even bigger lion's share.
Sure. So maybe like California versus Wyoming, and maybe it would be 60-1 instead of 50-1 or something like that. Like,
exactly. Things like this. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I can buy that makes some amount of difference. I don't think it actually makes that like you were saying that it might make the House unwinnable for Republicans. I don't think I could buy that, just because like there are a few very small states that only get 1 or 2 representatives, and
most of them only get like 1.
Right, yeah. There are a few like Wyoming, Alaska, and a couple others. I think like Rhode Island only gets 1. So for those states, it makes a difference that they might wind up being slightly overrepresented, just because you can't bring them below 1 seat. But if you had like a 600 people in the House instead of 435, then they could get like a smaller fraction.
Yeah, like I'm just curious. Like, is California only 53 times the population of South Dakota? I feel like it's probably way more.
I don't think it's way more. I think it's maybe like 80 times the population.
South Dakota population's 880,000 basically.
I think Wyoming has the lowest population.
Yeah, it's actually, they're actually getting more. Okay, yeah, then maybe I'm just delusional. When I heard that, I was like, that just seems crazy. That we haven't that this temporary measure in like the 30s like just has become the new de facto.
That could matter if we had states with very small populations. That could matter.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if someone. God, I'm such a horrible speller. I'm wondering if there's some thing here that says for each state percentage of population. I'm not wondering electors. I'm wondering people per house seat. Yeah. No, I guess all these numbers look to be pretty even, huh?
Like, yeah, I mean, like,
looks to be the lowest,
give or take 20% or so, right? Like some of them are 500,000, some of them are 800,000, but it's not like wildly off.
Oh wow, Delaware is 900,000. Jesus, these guys are getting destroyed.
Yeah, they're getting destroyed.
Yeah, so being a small state will do that to you in terms of like actual size.
Well, the small states are going to be the ones that are both over and underrepresented.
Yeah. Yeah, I just mean I wouldn't be surprised if this is just because Delaware is so small, like physically. I wonder if there's like a best practice on how many districts you're supposed to put in a certain space. Like I wonder, like are there like 3 different districts that overlap with New York City, or is that just 1? All those people are just like,
it's more than 3. It's like
okay, it's like a ton.
Well, because I think the population in New York City is like 7 million or something like that. So
yeah, it's something crazy. It's like it's like more than like the next 3 biggest cities in the U.S. combined.
Yeah, so if they have 7 million people, something like that, then they probably have like 10 districts.
Curious here. Oh, please don't be broken. What? Oh. Okay, here we go. Okay, yeah, no, never mind. Okay, yep, they've got there's a lot of lines here.
Yeah.
Huh, yeah, I wonder why Delaware's ratio is so out of whack, because I think it was the highest.
Yeah, so here's what I think is probably going on, is they've probably got, like, you take the population of the country, you divide it by, 435, and then you're trying to get that many people per district, and then if Delaware, it has not enough people to round up to where you would get 2 representatives, but it has like more than it's supposed to have for 1. So if it has like 1.4 times the number of people that it should have for 1 district, like, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Then they would just round it down to 1, and yeah.
It's funny. Columbia had just 0.
Well, yeah, that's who's actually getting screwed the most is DC.
Yeah, then I don't think they've got Puerto Rico here or Guam, but yeah, that would be really funny to see as well.
Yeah.
Especially because Guam is like, I think Guam per capita has like the highest military recruitment out of any area. It even beats like South Carolina and Idaho, which are normally like the top 2. Anyways, Yeah, I think that was just about it in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act. I think I have like one or two things on chips if we want to go over that as well.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, let me just see here. Let's see. I've got one good article on it, and then potentially like a mini podcast.
Okay.
Council on Foreign Relations anticipating a U.S. South Korea semiconductor alliance. A wholesale semiconductor alliance with the United States and South Korea needs to be preceded by clear communication, improved transparency, and greater interdependence to foster trust and better manage alliance relations. By Chris Park. During a recent summit trip to South Korea, President Joe Biden made his first stop at Samsung Electric's plant and toured the semiconductor manufacturing facility that would serve as the model for a $17 billion factory in Texas scheduled to begin operations in 2024. Biden and the newly inaugurated South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol, in a joint statement, also outlined several areas of bilateral cooperation for addressing supply chain vulnerabilities in critical technologies. The United States-South Korea Technological Alliance could be the means to strengthen and upgrade the security alliance. Semiconductors are at the heart of a bilateral technology cooperation, as policymakers in both Washington and Seoul are intensely focused on this sector. President Biden named semiconductors as one of the 4 critical products to U.S. security and called for friendshoring, where production of those goods are brought back to the United States and its like-minded allies. Both the United States Innovation and Competition Act and the Americas Competes Act, the Senate and House versions of the bipartisan China competition bill slowly making its way through Congress, include $52 billion for domestic semiconductor research, design, and manufacturing. Similarly, South Korea renewed its interest in supporting the advanced semiconductor industry in recent years. Former President Moon Jae-in worked to form a, quote, semiconductor belt, end quote, spanning across Yonggi and, Chung,
Chung Chung.
yeah, hold on, I don't want to mess this one up. Hold on. There we go. We've got, oh, you son of a bitch. You can't ever Google pronunciation of these things either because it's like there's a million bots that will produce videos where they just do the text to speech. Like, yeah, I bet there's just gonna be text to speech and it's not gonna be even remotely close to what it actually is.
I
Oh, it's gonna be another ad.
I used to study Korean, so I'm reasonably confident that it's Chung Chung, but
Yeah, I always like to do the vlogs, but okay, we're gonna forge forward. Chungcheong provinces. Former President Moon Jae-in worked to form a semiconductor belt, end quote, spanning across the Gyeonggi and Chungcheong provinces with resilient supply chains. The South Korean National Assembly passed the National Advanced Strategic Industry Act during the Moon administration, empowering the Minister of Trade, Industry, and Energy to regulate the export of advanced semiconductors to foreign companies. President Yoon also declared his intentions to make South Korea a, quote, semiconductor superpower, end quote, and vowed to train more semiconductor specialists by expanding the quota for engineering students at universities. Semiconductor cooperation with the United States and South Korea will better situate both countries from China-related semiconductor supply chain disruptions that are likely to emerge in the coming decades. A potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan can trigger a massive semiconductor shortages, given that the island is home to the world's largest foundry operated by the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. At the same time, China's semiconductor industry continues to grow with generous state subsidies and aggressive production of less advanced chips that flood the market with cheaper semiconductors, creating unfair competition and market disruptions. Chinese domestic capacity to produce cutting-edge chips will moreover give China the ability to more readily develop advanced weapon systems and malign surveillance tools. Man, that is just one of the craziest things that, it just so happens that Taiwan, this hugely geopolitical contentious thing between China and the West, the two great superpowers, also just happened to be the country with the biggest semiconductor chip foundry. Especially when I don't think a lot of people realize there's a handful of factories that can make the top end of semiconductors, to the point where you have to schedule the use of these factories for your products years in advance. Like when the PS5 came out, I remember people why don't they just make more? It's like, dude, you have to schedule at these factories 7 months in advance. And there's 3 places in the world you can make them. It is actually crazy. If one of those places got destroyed, it would actually wreak so much chaos on the world economy.
I'm a little bit surprised to see this article suddenly saying the thing about unfair competition and malign surveillance tools, right? Because it seemed like it wasn't taking an editorial tone before that, and then all of a sudden, fuck China. I don't know.
Well, I think it's definitely fair to talk about advanced weapon systems and malign surveillance tools, because advanced technologies like these do really rely on these, and that has been a strategic vulnerability in the past. The United States actually did this. One of the programs in the aftermath of 2001 that was lead by Edward Snowden was a program called Bull Run, where I think it was the NSA, it might not have been the NSA, but some agency would go to companies that were sending out computer hardware to foreign markets, and they would embed vulnerabilities in those. So they'd be like, "Oh, Dell, you're sending hard drives to Iran. We're gonna we're gonna put something on that just in case. You never know where that hard drive might end up in some Iranian like weapons server." And
I
that
see.
was a real thing.
So when they say malign surveillance tools, that you don't think that they're like saying China's being evil. They're instead just saying they are
It might
surveillance.
be. I could be steelmanning them inappropriately here. There was a hypo that says how China exports authoritarianism. Oh my gosh, money technologies fueling repression worldwide. Oh, I need a well. We'll never know. I need a subscription for that website. Sorry. Yeah, they could be taking an editorialized position. I think that this is just a blog post, so it might be a little more editorialized.
I mean, maybe like it
some
could be that
communities.
I'm looking at it in the context of them having just said that it creates unfair competition, and it looked like they were taking an anti-China tone here, but which is
Yeah.
fine. I was just surprised that it like
Yeah.
suddenly popped up halfway through an article with it when it didn't appear to be that way earlier on. But
Let's see here. So the United States is pushing to formalize semiconductor cooperation with South Korea through the quote Chip 4 end quote alliance framework, which also includes Japan and Taiwan. The Union administration reportedly faces significant pressure from the United States and will make a final decision by the end of August. While details about the new quadrilateral framework are scant, full realization of the technological alliance between the two security allies will likely involve wholly detaching China from the global semiconductor manufacturing process and a significant reduction of semiconductor sales to China. It can also include technology sharing between American and South Korean chipmakers. While certain aspects of the vision may be attainable in the future, several issues will likely frustrate expectations of a technological alliance. Despite talks of cooperation, U.S. and South Korea companies, and by extent the two economies, fundamentally are technological competitors. The semiconductor industry is highly competitive, with each firm focusing on acquiring certain cutting-edge capabilities before others, and consequentially increasing their market share. Top firms of a particular product dominate that category and reap profits given the business costs associated with switching suppliers, reinforcing the winner-takes-all nature of the semiconductor industry. Intel and Samsung, for example, are both constructing new semiconductor fabrication plants in the United States and will compete on contract manufacturing chips. The two countries hold a level of distrust towards each other's industrial policies that support the semiconductor industry. The United States has been wary of state subsidies revived by South Korean firms for warping competition and lacking transparency. South Korea initially feared that only U.S. firms stood to receive subsidies in the Chips for America Act. The U.S. Department of Commerce requested chip makers, including South Korean firms, to provide supply chain information to help the Biden administration address global chip shortage was also met with considerable misgivings from both South Korean governments and businesses. Further, the South Korean chip manufacturers have significant business interests in China, and U.S. policies on supply chains will hurt their bottom line. Samsung and SK Hynix both operate plants in Xi'an and Wuxi, respectively, and the Chinese market accounts for over 40% of South Korean chipmaker sales. In 2021, the United States blocked SK Hynix from upgrading its Wuxi plant with ASML's latest extreme ultraviolet EUV lithography machine, fearing that introducing the most advanced lithography equipment to China risked the technology being stolen and used for Chinese military and modernization efforts. South SK Hynix now is concerned with profitability and plant viability issues due to its inability to upgrade the plants. South Korean chipmakers are also reportedly worried that joining the Chip 4 alliance would hurt their operations in China due to both U.S. imposed restrictions and Chinese retaliation.
so is SK Hynix, is that an American company or is that a
I think it's a
Korean?
South Korean one. I assume SK is for South Korea.
Oh yeah,
SK
that's
Hynix is
probably
South
right.
Korean supplier of dynamic random access DRAM chips and flash memory chips. It's the world's second largest memory chip maker to Samsung Electronics and the world's third largest semiconductor company. Formed as Hyundai Electronics Industrial Co. In 1983, also known as Hyundai Electronics. The company's manufacturing sites include the United States, China, and Taiwan. In 2012, SK Telecom is a shareholder. Hynix merged with SK Group, the third largest conglomerate in South Korea. Company's major customers include Microsoft, Apple, Asus, Dell, MSI, HP, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. Other products use Hynix customers include DVD players, cellular phones, set-top boxes, personal digital systems, networking equipment, and hard disk drives. So yeah, these guys, and this is this is like the sort of line you have to toe with trying to create these very limited with trying to create these like very controlled supply chains, is that at the end of the day companies are here to make money, and there could be a real tension when this is being made for geopolitical reasons, and those geopolitical reasons can then interfere with the bottom line. It's actually very similar to what we were just talking about with the EV market, where some of these EV companies are like, man, I don't know if I want to get on board with the 20% tax credit if it means if the cost is not doing business in China. My competitors are still be doing business in China. I'm not so sure about this. It's actually really, it's actually just the exact same thing over again.
Yeah. So the reason I was asking a moment ago, like whether that was a South Korean or American company, was I was surprised to see the United States like blocking them from doing anything, right? Because it seems like if they're a South Korean company, the United States is trying to tell them what to do, they could just say like, "Fuck off!" We're not under your.
Well, I bet it's going to be that this technology was like something from America that SK Hynix. So they probably weren't blocking SK Hynix as much as blocking SK Hynix from obtaining the technology if they were going to use it.
Well, it says ASML, right? So maybe that's an American thing. From upgrading its Woozy plant with ASML's
latest extreme ultraviolet.
So I don't know what ASML is.
There we go. Exclusive U.S. China Tech, more clouds. SK Hynix plan for a key chip factory. Let's see, this is a short read. November 18th, Seoul. Planned by South Korea's SK Hynix to overhaul a huge facility in China just so it can make memory chips more efficiently are in jeopardy. Sources for more with the amount told Reuters because U.S. officials do not want advanced equipment used in the process to enter China. The potential setback could make SK Hynix one of the world's biggest suppliers of DRAM memory chips that go into everything from smartphones to data centers, the next victim of the geopolitical struggle between the United States and China. SK Hynix production plans call for the company to upgrade a mass production facility in Wuxi, China with some of the latest ultraviolet lithium EUV chip making machines by the Dutch firm ASML. 3 people with the knowledge matter said. The United States in the past has objected on the grounds that shipping such advanced to China could be used to strengthen the country's military. A senior White House official declined to comment specifically on the matter because whether U.S. officials will allow SK Hynix to bring EUV tools to China, but the official told Reuters that the Biden administration remains focused on preventing China from using U.S. and allied technology to develop state-of-the-art semiconductor manufacturing to help China modernize its military. The Wuxi factory is critical to the global electronics industry because it makes about half of SK Hynix DRAM chips, which amount to 15% of the global total. Any major change is going to impact on global memory markets, where the analyst firm IDC says it's growing at 19% in 2021 alone. As newer styles of chips make a greater share of SK Hynix production in 2 to 3 years, the company will need to use the EUV machines to control its costs and accelerate production. The source of the knowledge of the companies and operations, China said. The extent of concerns inside of SK Hynix have not been previously reported. The situation is not resolved in the next several years. SK Hynix could stand a disadvantage against rivals such as number one memory chip manufacturer Samsung Electronics and the United States Micron Technology. The other 2 major players in the DRAM market, both Samsung and Micron, are also shifting to ASML's EUV machines, but are not using them at factory locations where machines face export restrictions. The question of the ASML machines has drawn enough concern within SK Hynix that Chief Executive Lee Seok Hee raised the issue with U.S. officials during a visit to Washington, D.C. in July, according to people on his visit. SK Hynix declined to comment on the matter, adding that it operates flexibly according to the various market environments and is doing its best to respond to market concerns about the issue. The Trump administration essentially mounted an extensive campaign to block the sale of ASML's technology to China-backed Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corp, lobbying the Netherlands government. From the White House, officials shared a classified intelligence report with the country's prime minister. An ASML spokesperson said that the company abides by all export control laws and views them as a valid tool for governments to ensure national security, but the company said the overreach of these controls, quote, might impact the production capacity needed to stay ahead of the increasing demand of semiconductors, end quote. Quote, it is likely that the widespread use of export controls could exacerbate microchip supply chain issues, which are already a major concern of governments and policymakers around the world because of the spillover effect to other industries, end quote, such as the automotive industry, the spokesperson said in the statement. Analysts do not believe the United States would view SK Hynix's effort to bring EUV tools into China differently than earlier efforts by Chinese firms. Quote, they're really caught between a Chinese rock and a U.S. hard spot, end quote, said Dan Hutchinson, chief executive officer of VLSI Research, who added that the rules would likely apply to any chip manufacturing operations in China, foreign or domestically controlled. Quote, anyone who wants to put an EUV tool in China gives China the capacity. Once it's there, you have no idea where to go after that. The Chinese could always seize it or do whatever they wanted to do, end quote.
Yeah, so it makes sense to me why the United States would want to block that. I was just initially confused about how is it that they could just block South Korean companies from doing things, and then I was even more confused when it said like, oh, ASML is actually a Dutch company. But I guess apparently they're like lobbying the Dutch government to get them to do
that's
it.
the power of being a world superpower. You can just roll up to a country like Dutch and be like, please do this, and there's a decent chance that they'll say yes. All right, let's see. So where were we? Yeah, here we go. Let's see. Yeah, so as evidenced by Samsung's planned investment in Texas, the South Korean private sector does not wholly oppose U.S.-led semiconductor supply chain restructuring despite some grumblings about recent Biden administration policies. However, the transition will nevertheless be painful and highly risky for firms that derive much of their profits from doing business with China. The South Korean government, too, understands the strategic rationale for moving supply chains away from China. South Korea vividly realized the national security risk of over-reliance on Chinese supply chains to the diesel exhaust fluid shortages starting in October 2021. Oh, I haven't even heard of these. Wow.
Yeah,
the DEF shock, which disrupted agricultural and shipping industries, elevated broader concerns about economic reliance on China. A widely circulated report by the Korean International Trade Association revealed that China accounted for 1,850 out of the 3,491 items for which the South Korean relied on a single country for 80% or more of imports. The Yoon administration has signaled that the, quote, America for security, China for economy, end quote, strategic model needs to be replaced with, quote, America for security, world for economy, end quote, model. However, the administration's political willingness and ability to do so remains to be tested. South Korea is a middle power hedge middle power hedger, between the United States and China. Technological cooperation, which ultimately is a balancing act against China, closely fuses economic and security issues and presents difficult questions for South Korea's strategic outlook. China has already criticized chips for as quote coercive diplomacy, end quote, and warned that South Korea would quote cause more harm than good, end quote, by taking part. If South Korea were to completely limit its cutting edge chips from China, South Korea may also open itself up to economic retaliation from China.
It seems pretty fair of them to say that it's coercive diplomacy. Like, it seems like it kind of is.
I mean, it's definitely partially coercive diplomacy, but I mean, the reality is like almost all diplomacy is coercive, right?
Yeah.
The only reason you're going to be going to the negotiating table is because you can't resolve it through naked force, or it'd be more expensive to do so. I mean, China's obviously employs this themselves to great effect with debt trap diplomacy and specifically infrastructure debt trap diplomacy. It was such an unbelievably wasted opportunity. When during the Trump administration, we were just totally silent on all the expansion China did with the Belt and Road Initiative, with expanding to Africa, with opening up foreign military bases, like a first for China in a really big way. And we just are, talking about the trans people are going after the kids, and it's like, oh my God, this is so dumb.
Yeah.
First steps. The alignment of U.S. and South Korean interests in cutting-edge technology demonstrated through the Biden-Union Summit makes cooperation on semiconductors a political priority. A full-fledged technological alliance may very well emerge in the future given strong U.S.-South Korea relations, shared concern about Chinese supply chains, and dominance of U.S. technology undergirding South Korean semiconductor production. Important first steps taken by both governments to improve communication and foster trust can open a path toward a more robust partnership that better prepares both economies for China-related disruptions. Interdependence between the allies should be increased, and friendshoring should go both ways. Semiconductor policies pursued by either government should be grounded on principles of reciprocal investment and equitable subsidy availability to build trust. The United States should also proactively work to reduce friction emanating from export control measures through high transparency communication. South Korean firms, whose main customers are in China, will also lose huge markets as a result of not only U.S. policy, but also the growth of SMIC and other Chinese semiconductor firms. While planned investments in new foundries can help address the medium-term semiconductor shortage risk, it can open up oversupply issues if the market demand does not meet the increased supply. The United States and South Korea need to work to find another region to augment and replace the Chinese market. End quote.
I mean, I guess that makes a lot of sense why they're saying like America for security, the world for economy rather than China for economy. Then.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's a real vulnerability. I mean, you see the exact same thing in Taiwan. Although Taiwan sort of goes more to Taiwan's effort because, if China really wanted to roll over Taiwan, they absolutely could, assuming no one else intervened. So the Taiwan's reliance on China really hurts China much more than the other way around, because of those semiconductor factories in Taiwan that are just so ludicrously important.
Yeah, well, this was talking about South Korea's reliance on China.
Yeah, I'm just saying that's another example where Taiwan is also very reliant on China. It's just in that case, it's more of a poison pill for China than the other way around because Taiwan's already in such a disadvantageous state that any mutual vulnerability is inherently going to help them because they're already so vulnerable.
Right, yeah.
But yeah, so. Or sorry, go for it.
Oh yeah. So to build on something you were saying earlier, it's like they were saying here that the Biden administration was making the semiconductor industry into a diplomatic priority, which it seems crazy that it wouldn't already be. I mean, maybe it was, but the way that they were describing it, it makes it sound like this is a new thing that we suddenly care about the semiconductor industry, and it's like, really, like, didn't you before?
Yeah, I think it's always been a concern, but it's part of this new question of like it's sort of been pushing the limits as to sort of these unfettered free trade alignments as they come into conflict with geopolitical realities. Where previously the American approach would be like, it's better to have the free market do it. Now there's this real question of like, well, should we try and insulate this somewhat from our political enemies so it can't potentially be a means to make us vulnerable? Because to some people, there would be it'd be a very similar repeat of that Taiwan example, where compared to the United States, everyone is vulnerable. So shared vulnerabilities are going to benefit them more than us because, I mean, real talk, almost everyone is already massively vulnerable to us because we are so overwhelmingly powerful.
Yeah, and I guess this whole structure isn't really a new thing in light of our kind of Cold War history. I mean, back then it wasn't really applying as much to semiconductors, but back then it still was the case that our desire to have free trade agreements was
Yeah.
kind of in conflict with our like geopolitical goals. And
Well, the interesting back then is that the geopolitical goals themselves were free trade, right? It was this idea of open liberal markets versus the Soviet bloc. So in that case, it wasn't like, oh, free trade with Russia. Like Russia's not going to do that. And then there was this idea that, oh, well, when China, in the 1980s, when you had the opening up of China and the liberalization of their markets under Deng Xiaoping, into a lot of people's minds, it was like, oh, we're winning. We're starting to influence them. And the thought was that this economic liberalization will lead to political liberalization, that China will become more democratic.
Right.
And then the Tiananmen Square massacre happens, and years go on, and it's a real question of like, is that going to happen? I actually don't think it's. A lot of people say, oh no, it's settled. That is not going to happen. I don't think that is necessarily the case. These things. China's still a crazy fucking country. And especially, who knows what the fuck is going to happen the day Xi Jinping dies and there's a massive succession crisis. You know, so I still think there's a real chance for that, but it's not a certainty. Maybe these market liberalizations cause political liberalization, but that's not a guarantee the way people thought it was back in the day. And then the question becomes, okay, wait a minute. These people can integrate into our economic system while still being geopolitically opposed to us, while still being, communist, this dictatorial one-party state that, does all these horrible things. Do we now try to limit their access to our world economic system that reaps them so much benefit? How do we even begin to do that when they're such an important place, when China is so big? They have such a huge degree of population. A huge part of China's rise is a return to the normal state of being, that of China had been a hugely important economic sphere of influence across the entire world. Chinese schools teach this as the century of humiliation, which is like just about from the time of European subjugation to the end of the Second World War. That was the century of humiliation where China wasn't at its rightful place as an incredibly important part of the world. So from a certain perspective, it's like, okay, China's going to be an important, when you have that much of the world's population, you're going to be economically important, bottom line. So is it better to have them in the system where we can exert some control, right? They do have some mutual vulnerability with us and dependence on us, or do we try and make them forge their own way? And if we do that, are we even going to be able to? China, because it's so economically important, has its claws deep in a lot of countries. New Zealand is a really scary one, where that is supposed to be something that's very much in the Anglo sphere of Western influence. But if you look at recently, I think it was like a year and a half ago, they announced that they would not be forwarding surveillance on China through the Five Eyes system, which is a huge deal. It's a massive fucking deal and didn't get that much press. New Zealand basically saying that one of the biggest intelligence sharing organizations in the world among the West, they weren't going to be forwarding any of their stuff on China along that, which is when China's like probably the biggest threat we have right now, which is just crazy. So then there's a real question of if we try to force them out, we're not going to be just forcing them out, we're going to be forcing other people out. Another great example would be the Wolf Amendment, which is a policy that the United States has that says if you want to cooperate with NASA in space, you're not allowed to work with China, which effectively says if your space program either has to be with the US or with China. And in some countries that does say, we're going to go with the US. But other countries say, no, we are going to go with China. And now we don't get access to them either.
Yeah. So I did a panel a few months ago on space exploration. So that kind of caught my interest, what you just said, because one of the big points that I was making was how half of the world doesn't really live in a country that has any like active space program, and it seems like they aren't about to, right? Like Guatemala is not about to send people to Mars, right? So it seems like the only way forward for those countries, I mean, they've either got to band together and make some giant international organization, which seems unlikely, or they've got to get on board with one of the space programs that's already underway, like with U.S., China, Russia, or EU, or
and when
Japan.
they do, they have to choose between these two big blocks of either the U.S. and the countries that work with the U.S., or China and the countries that work with China, because those countries that work with the U.S. aren't going to be allowed to work with a country that works with China for the same reason they can't work with China directly. So it really does stratify space development into these two things. And on the one hand, it's a really great case study because it shows the strengths and weaknesses of both sides. On the one hand, we're losing on all these countries. On the other hand, China's losing out on a lot too. And there is good reason to want China to lose out. In 2011, China did an ASAT space test, anti-satellite missile test, where they shot a missile and destroyed one of their own satellites in orbit, because they wanted to show us, oh look, we can shoot out satellites with a missile that are spinning around, at 1,000 miles per hour above the planet. And that isn't going to stop working if the satellite has a U.S. flag on it and not a Chinese flag. So just so you guys are aware. as much as a disaster as the Trump administration was, Space Force is actually a really good thing. I mean, to be clear, the Space Force is, you know, something that certainly the DoD had been working on for a long time. Then was like, okay, we're ready to finally do this. Trump, please give us your rubber stamp. You know, it's not actually Trump actually did that, but it's still a really good thing. I mean, at the end of the day, he still gets credit for giving the rubber stamp, because space is already being militarized. If you look at like how satellites will scan over areas, you know, in the South China Sea, China, when China's put up these artificial islands, satellite scanning of that is like a huge source of intelligence. See, like, oh shit, they're starting to dump sand and rock and gravel over here. They're putting up a new island.
It makes me wonder, like, you know, we have all these, or at least a few treaties about like demilitarization of space that are, you know, supposed to be in effect from a few decades ago, and it just seems like those have always seemed to me like they wouldn't really hold up well when people start to actually, like, as soon as militarization of space becomes more viable, people are not likely to continue honoring those treaties. But
yeah, it's those treaties are always going to take a backseat to geopolitical considerations. It's why the United States isn't party to like the International Criminal Court of Justice or the like a cluster munitions treaty, is because like at the end of the day, listen, we are not going to handicap ourselves when we're the world power that's trying to keep a lid on everything. We're just not going to do that.
You got anything else you want to say about this article on the semiconductor
No,
agreement?
I think yeah, it's just really striking to me how much it is sort of like you see the same issues coming up, where it's this question of how do we separate this supply chain from our geopolitical rivals, and you know, is doing that worth it? What are the challenges with it? It feels like a total repeat of the EV thing, which I think is really interesting to see that you're seeing two really important things with this coming up. I think it's very indicative of one of the issues of our times, which is what do we do about China?
Okay, so then you got this little like mini podcast thing that you.
Yeah, I've got a podcast. I think it runs for about half an hour. I don't know if we want to do that if you're running short on time, or if we want to cut it here or keep going. I'm totally fine with whatever.
I've got time if you do.
Yeah, sure. All right, let me just pull this up. Does that sound working for you?
Yes.
This is the most severe shortage of semiconductors in years.
The U.S. Senate passed a bill that would give manufacturers more incentives to make semiconductor chips.
Taiwan wants to make sure that it keeps its leading position in the semiconductor industry. The sector has been caught up in the U.S.-China trade tensions.
We're in competition with China and other countries to win the 21st century. We're at a great inflection point in history.
Right now, you're hearing my voice because of a silicon chip. Hundreds of them, in fact. You may know them by other terms like microchip or semiconductor. As the world has digitized, chips have become the lifeblood of innovation and the global economy. They're in almost everything we use. Access to chips can make or break a country's economic future. And as shortages pile up, countries are scrambling to figure out how to ensure their access. At the heart of the story is one company, TSMC, which manufactures chips that are found in everything from iPhones to fighter jets. No other company can do what they do, and as a result, the world depends on them. But TSMC is located on the island of Taiwan, and that puts it at the center of dangerous tensions between China and the United States. I'm Gabrielle Sierra, and this is Why It Matters. Today, our fragile relationship with the chips that power our world. So, what is a silicon chip?
Chips are the descendants of the original transistor, which was a kind of a switching device. It can do all kinds of things. And what happened is they started to put many, many transistors on an individual piece of silicon.
This is Don Clark. He has been writing about tech for more than 30 years, including 23 as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. These days, he's a contributor for the New York Times.
Now, the latest silicon chips can have billions of tiny, tiny transistors on there that can store data and do calculations.
So chips are essentially the little electronic foundation to the entire global tech economy.
This is Rebecca Heilwell. She's a reporter at Vox Recode.
These little chips are basically powering the ins and outs of all the little decisions that make up the devices that we use.
A chip is now used in just about everything you can imagine. I was fighting this morning with my espresso machine because it's got chips in it. And it was telling me that I couldn't do it because I hadn't done the mandatory cleaning it was monitoring for.
Your refrigerator, your computer, any video game console you have, your phone,
your microwave, your dishwasher, your Alexa smart speaker, your car. There are many chips in your car.
Any kind of electronic device has chips, and how advanced they are depends on what kind of device you're using, but they're basically in everything right now.
And it's not just consumer products. The construction equipment we use to build homes, schools, and offices requires chips. The medical field relies heavily on them too. And if that wasn't enough, there's another huge driver for chip demand: data centers. The massive server systems that power the entire internet, from Google to LinkedIn to Reddit. Every time you use these services, there are chips on the other side providing the information.
People particularly notice this now that we're streaming everything in our lives, from Netflix to homeschooling to whatever. But for the big broadcasters in the old days, if they were broadcasting over the air, people could log on with their TVs, but they didn't have to do anything to their facilities. They were just beaming the signal to all these different people. In the broadband streaming era, each person that logs on, basically, they have to buy more computing capacity to serve that person. So the more streams there are, the more chips are consumed.
Every photo uploaded to Instagram, every video on YouTube, all of it requires more computing power. To stay in the tech race, countries need a steady stream of new chips. But before we can understand their geopolitical importance, we first have to understand a bit more about how the chip industry works. So, we all know that computing power gets better over time. Every few years, we're offered a new generation of smartphones, gaming consoles, and laptops that are faster and more powerful than ever before. A lot of this progress is fueled by improvements to chips. But it doesn't just happen. In order to push forward, scientists and engineers have to figure out how to pack more and more transistors into the same space. And companies invest billions to help them do it. When they succeed, the payoff is huge. Last year, the semiconductor industry reported $439 billion in revenue.
We must be...
That is truly crazy, the fact that they're cracking $500 billion in revenue for an industry. I'm just wondering, the U.S. budget is I think like 3 or 4 trillion.
Yeah, I honestly thought it would have been...
Oh, you're muted, just a heads up.
Oh. Yeah, sorry. I honestly thought it would have been more than that, more than $500 billion.
Let's see. Yeah, I mean, just for one industry, though, because keep in mind, that's only the semiconductors. It's just, that's astounding.
I guess...
looks like it's right about 6 trillion.
I think there are a few industries that are bigger than that already, right? I think oil and entertainment and...
definitely oil if you threw it. So, yeah, 2.1 trillion, yeah. Mm-hmm. That's crazy. It's just especially crazy just because the semiconductor industry is so small compared to the oil industry in terms of the players. It feels like with the oil industry, there's tons of different companies around the world, whereas semiconductors, it really is like a handful of factories.
Yeah, and it's kind of amazing how the Middle East has been, and a few other areas have been so geopolitically important because of the oil industry. But if that's on the decline and the semiconductor industry is on the rise, then maybe Taiwan is the new kind of geopolitical hotspot. That plus all the China stuff going on. Yeah.
Making them by the millions right now? How big is the demand?
Well, trillions.
Trillions.
Literally trillions of chips get made every year. And they go from the price of less than a penny to thousands of dollars. So there's many different varieties of these things.
Do you think that you can give me a sort of step-by-step of how a chip is produced? What do the supply chains look like?
The supply chains are incredibly complicated. It starts with raw materials. So you have silicon, which is the ingredient in sand. And so they make this big cylinder thing, and then they slice it up and make wafers, which are usually 12 inches across. And then they start laying down and taking off materials from those wafers. And the most important step is called photolithography, where they trace the patterns of circuitry on those for each chip that's going to be made on the wafer. And there's a particular company called ASML in the Netherlands, which dominates that photolithography step. But they now make a machine called an extreme ultraviolet lithography machine. Each one of these machines is about $150 million a pop.
Wow.
It's probably the most complicated machine humans have ever created, and they are the only supplier of it. Then after that, all these chemicals are added, things are etched, things are baked, things are laid on. Anyway, once they have
Is that really
wafer
more complicated
created,
than like
they cut
CERN
it
or
up.
something?
It wouldn't surprise me. I'm not familiar with CERN, but I just know that when it comes to some of the most cutting edge stuff, the example that I am more familiar with is the machines to make the new mRNA vaccines with the like nanoparticles. It is just like the degree of certainty that you have to have and accuracy is just so ludicrous, where it can't be off by like a nanomilliliter, half a nanomilliliter. And in order to make a machine that doesn't make that mistake ever is just so insanely hard.
That makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I guess they've got their transistors or transistor equivalents are just like a few atoms wide now. So
Yeah. Yeah, you just can't have mistakes especially for the high end. These are things that are be going at like missiles and stuff, where it's just like this cannot have a 1 in a million fail rate, not even close. Especially if each missile is going to be having thousands of these. It's a lot of people don't realize, especially like for example with medical equipment, they'll look at like something like a EpiPen injector and be like, this is just plastic and epinephrine. Why is it so expensive? And they don't realize that the machine that makes a million of these and has to be sure that every single one of these, you can't have an EpiPen have like a 1 in 1,000 chance to fail, because when you're using it, it's because it's that you probably only have one and you're about to save someone's life. It is so crazily hard to make a machine that is perfectly accurate like a million times over.
Yeah, that makes sense.
These diamond saws to create the individual chips, and they're sent to separate companies that wrap them in plastic and make little connectors around them, and then they test them. And so really the whole supply chain gets really complicated because it includes all the raw materials. It includes all those companies that make machines that are used to do all those processing steps.
Right.
It includes the companies that have the big factories, the big fabs they're called, like TSMC and Intel and Samsung. And then there's the companies that package them and test them. And then various levels of purchasers and buyers and sellers. So they say now this, by some estimates, that the average chip crosses a national border 70 times before it reaches its end destination.
Wow. That's quite a lot of steps, quite a lot of
Semiconductors are very complex, especially in their supply chains, more so than other things. But it's just funny when they're talking about this. I mean, this is true of almost any product. There's a famous essay by some economist called I Pencil, and it says, "I am a pencil, and this is what I'm made of," and it just in the space of a couple paragraphs describes going down, just even if you got 3 degrees of separation, the millions of like things that have to come together for just a single pencil to be made. Think of the lumberjacks who cut down the wood, the food that they eat, who makes the food, who transports the food, who makes the things that make the food and transport the food, who transports the wood, who makes the vehicles that transport the wood, who makes the fuel, how does that get it? And it's just like, oh yeah, even a pencil. And the rest of the story is that these supply chains are so insanely complex that they're very difficult to manage, especially if you're trying to manage multiple. That's why, business logistics is such an important industry, and why a lot of times efforts to really try and corral supply chains can oftentimes blow up in your face if you aren't doing if you aren't like really on it, because they are just so crazily complex. That's why a lot of like we talked about with the EV things, it's a lot better to try and do it off of incentives as opposed to trying to just say you have to do this or trying to do it yourself, God forbid, because it just immediately blows up in your face. It's trying to like put like a can of worms back together.
Yeah, so like it's kind of crazy how we have to have this crazy integrated world economy just to have something as simple as a pencil, and then when you try to apply that to things that are much more, apparently the most complex machine in the world, or like these, electric vehicle industry, it just seems like this very elaborate, delicate setup that we're relying on in order for our economy to be what it is, and so it's this very delicate game that they have to play with the politics of this to try to make everything work.
Travel for one little chip. And guess what? If we thought demand was high before, the pandemic kicked it into overdrive. Netflix added 37 million users. Zoom went from 10 million to 300 million daily meeting participants. All of these processes need chips. To understand this better, we spoke to Ajit Manocha, the president and CEO of SEMI, the world's leading semiconductor industry association.
So we're on a growth path to start with, and then the pandemic hit us. Now, what did pandemic do? Immediately, we went homeschooling, working from home. We stopped coming to the offices. Social media companies became pretty big. The number of laptops and the mobile devices that we needed last year was unprecedented. I mean, I give the example. I have 3 grandkids in the ages of 3 to 6. Each one of them have 2 devices. They are homeschooling. They have their own laptop or iPad, and they know how to turn it on and how to communicate with the class, how to sit in the Zoom classroom. So imagine it's going on all over the world.
Right.
Virtually every semiconductor company is reporting record revenue. The demand is high.
When supply chains are stretched to their max and demand continues to increase, you end up with shortages. And that's exactly what happened over the last year. The consequences were so serious that even now, as vaccinations are rolling out in many countries, shortages and product delays continue to pile up. And the product that got hit the hardest during the pandemic is not one you'd immediately associate with chips. Cars. You've written about how over the last year we've seen this chip shortage due to the pandemic affecting global supply chains. So do you think you can take me sort of step by step through that story, sort of how it started and who it ended up affecting?
Sure. So at the beginning of the pandemic, some automakers were sort of estimating, okay, the pandemic means there's going to be an economic crisis, and obviously people aren't going to be buying as many cars, so we're going to basically jump off the line for chips because we don't think we're going to need as many. Then suddenly things reverse and the economic recovery starts happening again. And some car manufacturers want to basically get back online, get their chips, but suddenly there's all these device makers who have been demanding chips the entire time. And now the automakers are still dealing with that shortage and trying to catch up. And at the baseline, it takes a while to get a chip. It's not like you can just call up a chip manufacturer and say, I need like 10,000 more chips next week. Can you just make some extra? That's not how it works. We're talking about weeks and weeks and weeks of lead time. And now we see GM and companies like that having to leave their workers idle and close down factories because there aren't enough chips to keep their manufacturing going. And in the US, that's a real pain point because there are so many auto workers, and that's a population a lot of people really, really care about.
Car dealerships are bracing for lean months as computer chip shortages are causing supply nightmares thanks to the pandemic.
Kia will shut down for 2 days due to supply issues.
Honda is the latest firm to say it's paying a price for the global shortage of computer chips.
It's not just here that they're feeling the impact, it's really everywhere throughout our nation. Now keep in mind, the vast majority of new cars are built with these computer chips. So in short, no computer chips, no new cars.
That seems like a real fragile system right there.
It is fragile. And back when we were having a shortage of personal protective equipment coming from China, people started thinking, hey, some things are strategic. We can't rely on foreign places to supply some of these things that are just really necessary. So between the shutdown of the auto plants, which cost a lot of union workers their jobs, that puts a lot of pressure on a Democratic president. Meanwhile, you had this kind of gradual feeling that U.S. was getting too dependent on foreign suppliers, even allies in Taiwan and South Korea. So there's been a separate push in Washington to help the semiconductor industry, and they're now proposing a $50 billion infusion to help spur more U.S. manufacturing.
In fact, since our interview with Don, the Senate passed a $250 billion bill that aimed at boosting U.S. tech competitiveness, including $52 billion for chip production. And the U.S. isn't alone. Countries all over the world have recognized that access to chips is essential, and they are making big investments in an attempt to reduce their dependence on other countries. The epicenter of that dependence is TSMC, located 100 miles off China's coast on the island of Taiwan. TSMC's rise has left rivals like Intel almost a decade behind and made it one of the world's most valuable companies. At the same time, it has become a target of US-China competition, and, according to some analysts, could even pull the United States into armed conflict. More on that after the break. I wanted to tell you about another podcast I think you'll like, The Last Archive from Harvard historian and New Yorker writer Jill Lepore. This season, Lepore is investigating purveyors of doubt, hoaxers, fraudsters, pseudoscientists, and how the peddling of doubt evolved over the 20th century, leading all the way to the Capitol insurrection on January 6, 2021. This show is unlike anything you've heard before. History animated by long-lost archival tapes and documents, intrepid reporting, and radio drama reenactments.
If we had
The
more
Last
doubt, they
Archive
wouldn't be able to
unfurls
succeed
like
at
classic 19th
things like
Yeah.
pseudoscience.
Yeah, it is.
news of today. How do we know what we know? And why does it seem, sometimes, lately, as if we don't know anything at all? Listen to The Last Archive wherever you get your podcasts from Pushkin Industries. To understand TSMC's enormous power, you
I thought that
have
was
to
gonna be another
understand
read.
their place in the global semiconductor industry. Companies like Intel, Samsung, and AMD design chips. TSMC, on the other hand, doesn't design chips at all. It simply takes the designs from clients and then manufactures them. It wasn't always this way. Most designers used to manufacture their own chips. Intel still does. But as the semiconductor business grew over the years, skyrocketing demand and high manufacturing costs prompted many designers to outsource the manufacturing process to third-party fabrication plants.
Maurice Chang, who's founder of the TSMC, he came up with the idea that why not we create a wafer fab foundry where we will actually put all the investments and manufacture for the companies who are very good in designing chips. And manufacturing companies will take the blueprints and they will start fabricating based upon what the chip is supposed to be in final shape. And TSMC did a very good job of making that happen. And pretty soon people realize this is very good business for us. Now we can spend more money and time and effort on chip design and design a lot more chips instead of spending more money on building fabs.
TSMC has gotten better at it than anyone else on Earth, earning 39,000 patents for their manufacturing process along the way. Today, they serve over 500 clients, including Apple, Sony, Huawei, Alibaba, and the U.S. Department of Defense.
When you look at the company, it's staggering. They just announced that they're going to invest $100 billion in the next 3 years. They are absolutely at the leading edge, and there are very few, if any, competitors.
$100 billion by one company. That's almost twice as much as the spending approved by the U.S. Senate. This is David Sachs, by the way. He is a research fellow at the Council, where his work focuses on U.S.-China relations, U.S.-Taiwan relations, and Chinese foreign policy.
So around 90% of the world's most advanced chips are made by TSMC on Taiwan. And of course, Taiwan is a geopolitical flashpoint for the United States and for China.
Taiwan and China have a volatile relationship, which puts global chip supplies at risk. In order to understand this risk, we need to do a bit of history. In the aftermath of World War II, China underwent a long and bloody civil war. There were two factions, the nationalists and the Chinese Communist Party. In 1949, the nationalists were defeated and fled to their stronghold on the island of Taiwan. Since then, Taiwan has been governed independently from mainland China, with its own currency, passports, and military. Still, Beijing maintains that Taiwan is, and always will be, part of its territory. For a long time now, the schism has been a very touchy issue for China, for Taiwan, and for countries that want to interact with them. At the heart of the problem is a single worry. Will China someday invade Taiwan in an attempt to reunify the island?
Today, Taiwan is a thriving democracy with multiple peaceful transitions of power, firm civilian control over the military, and a vibrant civil society. And from the Chinese perspective, Taiwan is viewed as a symbol that the Civil War is not yet over. They believe that Taiwan has to become a part of China sooner or later, and they have reserved the right to use force to bring that about. The United States official position is that Taiwan's future is to be determined. So we don't take a view on Taiwan's legal status, but what we do emphasize is that anything that happens with respect to Taiwan has to come about peacefully and with the consent of the people on Taiwan. But still, the United States has certain commitments to Taiwan under the Taiwan Relations Act, namely to provide Taiwan with defensive weapons and to maintain the capacity to come to Taiwan's defense without actually saying that the United States will come to Taiwan's defense during a crisis.
So much of our Taiwan relations, and just relations with Taiwan in general by a lot of countries, is this like double speaking game you have to play where like you be like, we are gonna be able to come to Taiwan's defense, but we not necessarily we might not. You know, I'm just saying that we could if we wanted to. And it's just I really hate it because everyone knows what you're really saying. What you're really saying is like we are going to defend China, but you don't want to push the button too much. But then, and if that was all, it wouldn't be a problem. But then there's always these dumbasses who are like, look, they're saying they're not even going to defend Taiwan, dude. They're not even saying that. It's like there's always this legion of people who like somehow fall for the double speak, and it's just so frustrating to try and have conversations sometimes. I'm reminded of like sometimes like the like Russian propaganda where they'll say like, oh, we're definitely not like in Ukraine for like any to take over. And people will be like, yeah, look, they said it, bro. What what do you mean? It says right there. It's like, oh my god, dude.
So it seems to me like I don't know like why I'm not getting this, but it seems to me like there wouldn't be that much downside to just being clearer about the fact that we are willing to defend Taiwan, because it seems like the downside of it is like, oh, we're going to risk diplomatically pissing off China if we do that. But don't they already know that we're like what our stance is anyway? Like, what's the point of being
the way this was explained to me by someone who's much smarter than me is that it's a double game of public perception versus back channels. So in back channels, the U.S. is going to be like, yeah, we are absolutely going to, because you don't want to have unclear lines, because that's how then, really bad shit can happen. So there are going to be absolutely clear lines. But publicly, you don't want to press the issue because that is going to inflame it only more, right? Because that's going to get back to the public, right? It's kind of like the difference between... if the United States, well, a good example would actually be Nancy Pelosi's visit. Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan hasn't changed anything. We're still going to defend Taiwan before, we're still going to defend after. But flaunting that and being like, yeah, we're going to visit to Taiwan here. That there are tons of videos about people being really angry about that in China. It's kind of like the difference between like, you can imagine in back channels, the U.S. is like, China, we will defend Taiwan. Versus if the United States said, China, you can't do jack shit. You're a bunch of losers. You can't do fucking anything, and you should go cry. Because if you ever try to attack Taiwan, we will destroy you and obliterate your country. Right? Even though it's like if saying the same thing, the effect it can have, and then that's going to be really amplified when you're speaking to the public, right? Where like, presumably people in the back channels are going to be like, okay, nice like ego, dude. I'm not gonna let you like bait me into this. But saying that publicly really can inflame tensions. And even in a country like China, there is some amount of like power that the people wield, and the culture wields, right? Xi Jinping believes a lot of the things that he believes because he grew up and lived in China. And so the culture can affect, even in a country that is a democracy, the culture can affect the views of the people, including the people that make up the institution sometimes.
Okay, so I guess the public stance is not that we want to be less clear about defending Taiwan, but it's more that we want to be not belligerent about it and not drawing a bunch of attention to the potential conflict.
I think so, yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
And that's just my understanding. That could be totally wrong.
If you're a bit confused, it's not your fault. U.S. policy on Taiwan is ambiguous by design, and it centers on having the ability to defend Taiwan from China while not committing to do so. It has always been a very touchy situation, and now the world's most advanced and important chip manufacturer has been added to the mix.
If China is able to take over Taiwan, it can project power into the Pacific from the east coast of Taiwan. It can essentially regulate shipping in the South China Sea and exert leverage on shipping lanes that end up in South Korea and Japan. So those are the traditional arguments that have been given for why the United States should defend Taiwan. But with the emergence of TSMC and a growing recognition of its centrality to the global economy and to the technologies of the future, including military technologies, it is increasingly part of the debate. So should the United States defend Taiwan's democracy? Should it defend Taiwan because of its strategic location? And also, should it defend Taiwan because it is the world's only producer of the leading edge semiconductors, and how critical that is for US defense applications, for instance?
I recently heard someone call TSMC Taiwan's Silicon Shield. So how important is the company for Taiwan and its goals?
So I think that Taiwan and TSMC both understand the centrality of TSMC to Taiwan. So for instance, Taiwan is having to ration water right now for the island because it didn't have the same storms that it usually gets. And what it's been doing is it's let all the water flow to TSMC that it needs to produce semiconductors, and it's rationing it for households elsewhere. And to me, that really reveals that Taiwan understands the importance of TSMC to its economy, to its society, and also strategically.
So, Taiwan understands that TSMC raises its profile and makes it a more essential partner across the world. The United States understands that without TSMC, it would lose access to the chips that keep its economy and military moving. And China, for its part, is navigating many of the same fears.
China's fears have already manifested themselves, which is that the United States has been able to get TSMC to stop selling chips to Chinese companies like Huawei. And while China likes to throw a lot of money at problems like this and assume that if it just spends billions and billions of dollars, it can catch up with TSMC, it has so far made very little progress. It's still years behind TSMC. And while it's trying to catch up with TSMC, TSMC is already working on the next level.
Are we worried that semiconductors might pave the road to conflict? I mean, how do we avoid the trap of thinking that conflict is just inevitable?
Yeah, so to put this in perspective, China's official line is that it still prefers peaceful unification. And so what that means is actually using an array of coercive tactics, short of force, to convince the Taiwanese people that their future is inextricably tied to China and that the best outcome for them is unification with the mainland. And so I think it's important to still keep in mind that using force is their last option.
Will China eventually attempt to reunify Taiwan by force? If they did, would it pull the United States into war? And would the US and other countries lose access to TSMC's chips if China succeeded? These aren't questions you commonly hear in the tech world, but they are the questions that many countries are asking themselves as shortages spread and tensions increase. As a result, many have decided that microchips should be considered strategically essential and that they should spend billions to figure out how to make them on their own.
Prompted by the crippling semiconductor supply crunch around the world, US President Joe Biden held a virtual meeting with business leaders Monday, stressing the need to invest in what he called semiconductor infrastructure.
I received a letter from 23 senators, bipartisanly, and 42 House members, Republican and Democrats, supporting the Chips for America program. I've been saying for some time now, China and the rest of the world is not waiting. There's no reason why America should wait.
So Beijing has made chips a top priority for its next 5-year plan. Independence is one of 5, quote, fundamentals of China's economic development.
But as it turns out, chip independence can't just be built overnight.
So President Biden has $50 billion for the semiconductor industry in his infrastructure package, but that's just a drop in the bucket. The Semiconductor Industry Association estimates that the United States would have to spend north of $1 trillion over a decade to become self-sufficient for its chips. It's going to be very hard to become self-sufficient because it's frankly just cheaper to build these in Taiwan, and Taiwan has the engineering talent already in place. So it's going to be very difficult for the United States to close this gap.
In the semiconductor business, they talk about the learning curve, which is all about making more working chips on each wafer and getting their yield up so you're more profitable and more productive. And so you just have to keep producing these things to learn all the little tweaks and knobs and temperature settings and chemical adjustments you got to make. So there is a tendency, once a company gets in front, for them to stay in front.
That doesn't mean that the US is giving up the chase. If the Senate-approved bill passes in its current form, it would provide $52 billion over 5 years to boost chip production and research. Intel plans to spend $20 billion to build 2 new plants. And the US is subsidizing TSMC's new $12 billion factory in Arizona. Other world leaders are making big moves too. The EU plans to invest up to $60 billion in chip design and production over the next 2 to 3 years. China plans to invest $118 billion as part of its most recent 5-year plan. Chip production is expensive, but money isn't the only factor. Is part of this competition a race to get the best and brightest minds in the industry?
It is very much so. And, all these companies hire, all the PhDs they can and all the best electrical engineers and computer scientists. The US educational institutions produce not the greatest number necessarily, but the best. But right now, I think the stats are like 60% or so of the students pursuing PhDs in those disciplines are foreign born. So a lot of them tried to work here, use their educational degree to help get a job here and stay in America. But the Trump administration made that very difficult. And meanwhile, companies got stronger abroad. So some people say from Taiwan, for example, who would have wanted to stay here, cycle back to Taiwan. The same thing was true in mainland China, I think. So it is a race, and consequently, the Semiconductor Industry Association and people like that have lobbied hard for immigration policies that make it easier for people to move from country to country and for educated people to stay here.
Yeah, because traditionally we think of the US as having an advantage in getting the world's brightest minds, but it seems like we may be losing that advantage.
Yeah, in my opinion, we're shooting ourselves in the foot because I think we should, staple a green card to every PhD in electrical engineering,
In a sense, it shows that the United States doesn't have the talent that it once had. It's underinvested in R&D and it's underinvested in STEM education. And interestingly, if you listen to TSMC's founder, he will say that the United States doesn't have the engineering talent to make it viable for TSMC to relocate these operations to the country. And he will point to Taiwan's engineers as a big asset for TSMC going forward.
So you can invest all the money, have a fab, and if you can't hire people,
right,
that's going to be a problem. I think that's the way things are shaping up now. When countries start declaring the importance of semiconductors for nationalistic reasons, there are 2 parts of this answer. The policy will be, okay, whatever I need to do to support the semiconductor industry in my country, policies will be in that view. But the good thing is, the second part of this is that there's no one country who can do everything from start to finish. Okay, so you have to depend on multiple countries. So the policy makers will definitely start thinking, my gosh, this is a global supply chain. We need to collaborate more with like-minded countries who are part of the integrated supply chain. And we need to make sure not just only looking at it from the nationalistic point of view, but also from a global point of view, that we got to work together with multiple countries because this supply chain is interdependent on many countries to make a chip.
I think that's particularly relevant with what they had just mentioned earlier about the PhDs. and how it is so critical to maintain, like a country's greatest resource is its people. Getting more electrical engineering PhDs and stuff like that is such a good thing. It's another thing that China does that we really should be trying to replicate, where they will have these programs for people from African countries to come and go to Chinese schools. And then when they go back to their countries, they are tied into the Chinese sphere of influence. They know people. They speak in China. They speak Mandarin, and they're going to be more likely to do business with Chinese companies and stuff like that, and have those inroads there, as opposed to in America. It's such an important thing to try and tie people into our sphere of influence as opposed to the Chinese sphere of influence. And a great way to do that is with education.
Isn't that a thing that they're kind of trying to emulate what we were already doing, though?
Well, I think there's a big people come to American schools just because they're really good, but
Yeah.
China, I believe, has specific programs where they will go to like African countries and they'll say, "Hey, we will take these kids and we will put them through school on us," and then they can come back. Like they'll go to Chinese universities, for example. I believe it's actually part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Sometimes that they'll give like these grants to specific areas where it's like, oh, your kids get to go to like good schools in China for free. But then it also has the added benefit, not just as a negotiation tool, but then the act of those people going to those schools ties them into the Chinese sphere of influence, makes them much more likely to be when they make businesses and try to start expanding working companies and stuff. They're going to be leaning towards working with China or companies or companies from China, or countries that are closely aligned with China.
Right. So to some degree, we were de facto already doing that, but I guess China's taking a more active role and doing it on purpose, in a way that we kind of weren't before.
Yeah.
One thing actually two things I wanted to point out. One was I looked up the Korean spelling of that province, and it is Chungcheong. Okay. And then the other thing was earlier when we were talking about the CHIPS bill. I was listing off the list of countries that we had free trade agreements with, and I didn't point this out at the time, but Taiwan is not one of those. So if we're specifically trying to make our industry dependent only on either domestic production or production with countries that we have those free trade agreements with, that's specifically at the expense of our trade relationship with Taiwan.
Yeah. And then that's going to be more relevant, in the EV market, because I think Taiwan's semiconductor chips are, I think, less relevant to that, because I think that's specifically about the battery production. And I don't know if the batteries use that many semiconductors, but I think it's illustrative of the point that we need to be doing more to tie these countries in, because presumably we want a similar thing with our semiconductors.
Yeah, you're right. Actually, I think the battery thing isn't really especially reliant on semiconductors. I guess I was under the impression though that bill had a lot to do with trying to make several of our industries independent of like, because I remember they were emphasizing like specifically not needing to import raw materials from China, that kind of thing. But
because those are the raw materials that they use for batteries.
Right, so maybe I'm wrong to try to tie that as directly to Taiwan as I was trying to, but I don't know.
I still think it's relevant insofar as it's like an example of very similar to how in that article on the batteries they pointed out we don't have a free trade agreement with Japan. And Japan is very akin to Taiwan, not for semiconductors, but for these batteries, because they do so much of that processing. And it's just another example of, if we want to be trying to make sure we're not reliant on China for this, critical thing, then in the same way that we are going to need a free trade agreement with Japan for the batteries, we really need a free trade agreement with Taiwan for the semiconductors.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Or like the whole TPP thing, like you were saying earlier.
Yep.
Yeah.
Chips have become an irreplaceable part of our world. We need them for every call we make, every visit to the doctor, every show we watch, every car we build. They're critical to economic growth, innovation, and defense. The need to create them can lead to good things: investment in STEM education, alliances, fruitful competition between researchers, and technological breakthroughs that better our world. But like any other essential resource, they also have the power to fuel divisiveness, trade disputes, nationalism, and even armed conflict. The world is learning just how much it depends on them, and that it can no longer tolerate the fragility revealed during the pandemic. We need a better system. But what type of system will we build? resources used in this episode and more information.
So do you think the passage of these two recent bills is going to have any implication for the midterms? I mean, I know they're not as central to our national conversation as something like Roe versus Wade is, but it seems still noteworthy that
I think it'll be in specific races, right? So no I don't think a significant chunk of the electorate is going to be like, oh my god, the CHIPS Act, let's go, Brandon. Like I think that's going to happen. But what absolutely can happen, is like, I don't know if actually Joe Manchin is up for like re-election, but like Joe Manchin, for example, goes back and says, now hold on a minute, I just got a bill where they're going to get the 26% tax credit to bring in jobs to West Virginia, like a new solar plant. And that's going to be, they're going to need welders, they're going to need electricians, they're going to need plumbers, construction workers, right? And especially if we see some of companies already start to move on that. If like, the week before, if like 2 weeks before the election, happens and there's some Democrat in a seat and in that area a company announces like, all right, we're open up shop, we're gonna need construction crews, like let's start this process, that can absolutely be huge. But honestly, God, the biggest thing in the midterms is just going to be the fact that, Republicans got unlucky and it looks like the economy is turning around in a really big way. And if the current trends continue for another 2 months, the economy is probably going to be in a really good spot come November. And if that's the case, then Republicans are going to be in a really bad spot. They'll still have the anti-incumbency advantage of the fact that this is midterms, and midterms always go well for or always go badly for the incumbent party. So Republicans will have that advantage. But I mean, it feels kind of depressing to say, but like sometimes the economy is good and you win, and then sometimes the economy is bad and you get George H.W. Bush.
Yeah, I think the public just tends to have a lot of magical thinking about the giving both too much credit and too much blame for the economy to whoever's in power at the moment. Manchin is up for re-election in 2024, not this time around. But
yeah, I think actually, from one analysis I've seen, is that the Democrats are actually looking a lot better that they are in the Senate than they are in the House, just because of what specific seats are up in the Senate.
Right.
I think actually right now, I think the 538 model, which is going to be the best one to go by, says Democrats are slightly favored in the Senate and then actually slightly defavored in the House.
Right. So the reason for that would be that House seats House members have to be reelected every 2 years, whereas Senate members have to be reelected every 6 years, and it's like
which
1/3 of the Senate each time.
Yeah, exactly. So, it leads to sometimes these weird elections where like every seat that's up is a Republican seat, so Republicans have nothing to gain and everything to lose. Versus other years, it's like Democrats have nothing to gain, everything to lose. So yeah, it leads to some really like lopsided elections sometimes.
So the people who are running for Senate re-election this time would be people who were elected in 2016. So in order for a party to gain seats in the Senate, they have to do better than they did in 2016. And as you'll recall, 2016 was a relatively good year for Republicans, which would explain why
it would seem particularly likely.
Yeah, like it doesn't seem likely that they'll do better this year than they did in 2016. They could, but
yeah.
Whereas the House, they would have to do better instead than they did in 2020, and 2020 was not a good year for Republicans, and so therefore they're more likely to pick up seats there.
Let's see, here we go.
So Georgia, Arizona, Pennsylvania, seems like.
Yeah, because I know Warnock is back up for re-election because the guy who he replaced, not the guy because he replaced Loeffler, Kelly Loeffler, was appointed as part of like a special election. So even though he just got elected in 2021, he's going to be up for re-election this year. Let's see if there's a specific, just like how many Republicans are up versus how many Democrats are up.
I'm trying to think if any of these states are ones that are likely to be particularly affected by the economic impacts of any of this stuff that we're talking about today. Like, I guess I don't have any particular reason to think so, but I don't know that there's an electric vehicle industry in Georgia, particularly, or something like that. But
No, yeah, it's just a question of how will individual senators or representatives be able to leverage that to their base. Are they gonna be able? And then of course there's also the auspice of Roe v. Wade. Is that gonna remain in people's minds as well? Because it's really just a question of motivating your base to get out, less than changing minds.
right, and I would guess that the Roe v. Wade thing is probably much more important. So these
Yeah.
two.
The question is though, is it gonna still be are people still gonna remember? It's definitely more relevant, but like the worry is like, in 3 months, people are just gonna like have forgotten. Like or like some people are just gonna like not be as impassioned anymore, and that's gonna result in like 20% less turnout than it would have been if Roe v. Wade had gotten turned over, a week before.
Yeah, I find it hard to believe that people are going to forget about the Roe v. Wade thing, but like supposing they do, then like if Roe v. Wade isn't a dominant thing in the elections, then I would expect it to be like you said, just the economy having either recovered or not. As of November would probably be the dominant issue.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, New York Fed, I think, just yesterday announced like inflation growth was 0, I think.
Oh, nice. I didn't catch that.
Yeah, I'm trying to see. Yeah, New York Fed, blah, 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 blah. Blah, blah, blah. Substantial declines in short, medium, and long-term inflation expectations. Expectations about a year ahead pricing fell sharply. Home price growth expectations and year ahead spending growth expectations pulled back from recent series highs. Household income growth expectations improved. Main findings are okay. I don't want to read this, but yeah, inflation down. I love Joe Biden. God bless.
And then one other thing we haven't talked about yet was the raid on Mar-a-Lago that just happened.
That and the Jan 6 stuff. We'll see, man. There's still a real battle for the soul of the Republican Party, and it's not clear who's going to win.
Yeah, and of course we don't even know what's coming out of the Mar-a-Lago raid yet. We know almost nothing about it so far, but you could imagine perhaps something crazy comes out of it that could affect the
right now, I think, according to a bunch of insider sources from pretty reputable places, it has to do with apparently some confidential documents that Trump just took when he left the White House that you're not supposed to take. And especially funny that one of the laws you're not supposed to take them is one he passed in response to Hillary Clinton email server, which is just like, I mean, it's so funny, but at this point it's like, yeah, I mean, that sounds like something Trump would do, pass a law to stop Hillary Clinton from taking documents, and then he does that exact thing and it gets used against him. I mean, that sounds like Donald Trump.
Yeah, it does. So that could be legally impactful, but probably not electorally impactful if that's what it turns out to be.
Well, what the thing is, where it could be electorally impactful is if it's kind of like a January 6th moment where it's so big, Republicans have to stand up and say which side they're on. And if Republicans stand up and say, I'm on the side of Trump, when Trump looked really bad, that could turn voters. Virginia, for example, is a place where Biden won Virginia, I believe, in 2020. There was a good let me double check that, make sure I'm not.
He did. You're
right. But then Youngkin won the special governor election, and it looks like there was a big contingent of people that voted Biden Youngkin. People that are, fundamentally, more conservative, not very progressive, but like they look at Trump and they're like, okay, this guy's a fucking psychopath. So the question is, if the Trump issue blows up and it becomes like a big talking point, and then Republicans come down on the wrong side of public opinion, even among moderates and even members of their own party, could that then lead to them voting for a more moderate Democrat, someone like Joe Biden, right? Someone like Joe Manchin, Jared Polis, stuff like this.
Mm-hmm. So the thing is, like something like January 6th, I think was kind of shocking to a lot of people, where it's just like Trump hiding some documents just doesn't seem to me like it's going to grab attention on that same level.
Yeah, it has to be something crazy where like it's like documents related to like national security or something, or if it's documents relating to January 6th, that could be something that could totally blow. But yeah, as of now, we only have like an indication that's about documents, and that's it.
Yeah, I mean, now if it extrapolates into something else, then who knows? Like if Trump ends up going to prison or something crazy like that, then we've got
lock him up.
Yeah, but
that's it. I mean, that's just one of those classic things where it's like I am a moderate left-leaning person. I believe in the power of being a moderate and stuff. I love Joe Biden. I love Joe Manchin, stuff like this. But I am very sympathetic to the Democrats that are like, these motherfucking Republicans don't get to complain. When we start to say, when Trump gets raided by the FBI, when 2016 DN or RNC, they're chanting lock-her-up. Like, God, just get the fuck out of here, you bastards.
Mhm.
Rules for thee, but not for me. It's just unbelievable sometimes what Republicans get away with.
Yeah. Okay, so let's see. Anything else you want to add on either of these bills or on?
No,
any of the
I think
stuff
this is a great video. Okay, I'm schizophrenic. I don't know. We did not watch a video. I don't know why I said that.
Podcast.
These were some great articles, and there's a
Articles and a-
podcast, and
Yeah.
there's an Audible podcast. Okay.
Yeah.
I really enjoy digging into the actual legislative stuff. I think it's really interesting and fun, and then digging into China, one of my favorite subjects. If people are interested in learning more about China, I highly recommend Kraut's video called Trump's Biggest Failure. In fact, actually, maybe we should review a Kraut video or two. That could be fun.
Oh yeah. You want to do that next week?
Yeah, actually, yeah, maybe. Let me just. I want to double check. I know Kraut was on a panel. I meant to watch this panel, and then like 3 months passed.
Whose panel was that?
I don't remember, but I remember Kraut. I think it might have been a Chud Logic panel, or at the very least, Chud Logic was on it. But it was a panel talking about React content, and Kraut was on it, and he mentioned some specific stuff about how he does and doesn't mind. So I would want to double check that and just figure out what his things is, or I could just go on his Discord. I can't fucking find. Hey, if anybody out there has a link to Kraut's Discord, please send it to me because every time I look it up, it's like a dead link that I can't find. So, all right. Anyways, yeah. But yeah, let me do that, and then actually, yeah, because I love all those videos. I basically just repeat everything they say.
Okay, cool. So do you want to shout yourself out or anything?
Yeah, what's up, guys? My name is Flowtrace. You can check me out at twitch.tv/Flowtrace, twitter.com/Flowtrace_. I do not stream as of yet, but I am on a number of Twitch politics panels, Prime Ks, Somebody Online, Wick, stuff like that. And you can check me out most every Wednesday here on Cricket Style J, twitch.tv/Cricket Style J. And I thank you all for watching and making this possible and sticking around.
Thank you for joining me. You're great as always.
All right, I'll see you, man.
See ya.